hit right across the back of the head.
Welcome to the third episode of Season 4 here for Shot Nostalgia as we continue our drive through Smoky Mountain Wrestling 1994. As always, live from No Sale Studios at the Tavern, ACEFIELD Retro, and joined with at Mullet.Mania, the Kentucky Waterfall Colton. What's up, dude?
What's going on, brother? Man, just stoked to be covering another couple of months of wrestling the way it used to be and the way we like it. Smoky Mountain Wrestling.
Absolutely. And Bellcaster may be joining us shortly. We're not sure. There's been a scheduling conflict, so we have it ready for him. We have the overlay, so if he's going to jump in, we'll let him in. But for right now, the Kentucky Waterfall and I are going to be covering all things for 2 months, May and June of 1994. Believe it or not, we are at episode 3 of 7. We have a lot to cover here. There's 2 months of action-packed stuff, and Smoky Mountain Wrestling, Colton, has been really one of those things that we didn't know what to expect, but I think it's kind of falling into a routine of, man, there's a lot of stuff on the table that we didn't even expect down the line.
Yeah, man, it's been, and as we're getting, we're six months into 1994 by the end of this episode. So we're really starting to ride that roller coaster a little bit. There's definitely some peaks and valleys in 94 with Smoky Mountain Wrestling, but yeah, man, some really wild shit. Like I knew there was a lot of big name talent sharing, but before going back and watching this year, like I did not know that Macho Man came down and worked Smoky Mountain with BRUISER BEDLAM. That's wild. Like that's just, I mean, I know he was in the commentary position at that point for WWF, but obviously he still had a lot of gas in the tank, went on to WCW and had a career after that. But just, I mean, I understand, Jake Roberts, we see some of these other bigger names, but still, like Macho Man's kind of on a different level at this point in time. And that's just a huge get for Jim Cornette in this promotion.
Yeah, absolutely. And when you see Macho Man pop up and working, the Knoxville Civic Center, or he's working any of the other places here for Smoky Mountain Wrestling, it hits a little bit different. We have this reverence of Macho Man that's been in the later years and respect for what he was doing. But you mentioned before, he was relegated to the announce desk at this time in the build to WrestleMania 10. They have his pretty much farewell match in WWF against Crush in that Falls Count Anywhere match at Madison Square Garden. And then they pretty much say goodbye. Vince thought he was too old. They wanted to move on, have a new generation, a younger skew of these wrestlers that eventually Macho gets sick of it, goes to WCW, and then has a resurgence in his career. And it's a shame, too, because of what was going on in WWF with all the talent coming in. You wonder what could have been and all these really super matchups that would have happened if Macho would have stayed in WWF. But, I mean, I think a lot of people would say their fandom started with Macho Madness in WCW. So I guess, one hand washes the other there.
Yeah, man, absolutely. It's like, God, how times have changed. Like Vince thought Macho was behind, past his prime. He's not even 40 at this point. And it's like, we watched Slammiversary from Impact this past week. Frankie Kazarian's 45 years old. He just went on a 25-minute banger with Eddie Edwards. Like it's crazy.
Yeah, 40 is the new 30 nowadays, and we have a different respect. And you can make the argument that there's different nutritionists and there's more of an understanding how to take care of your body. But we watched Bryan Danielson have his best year of his career in the last few years, and he's well older than Macho Man at this point and still going. We watched CM Punk as well. He's on the roster having some of the best moments of his career as well and, continuing. So, we wonder what could have been in Macho, and we just appreciate the time here for Smoky Mountain Wrestling. But we're going to be reviewing 2 months of action here. We got May and June 1994, and each week we're going to be going through all the TV tapings, all the newsletters from Dave Meltzer, and go through the live events to keep you up to date. So if there's a live event that happens that is of note, whether it be a title change or something like that, we will let you know the attendance. Colton will have you all locked in with the populations and the cities and the history of Kentucky and Tennessee, where they're going to find us. And there's always about a big event we're going to cover. Last week we covered, some of the big flag 10th pole events. We have this week Volunteer Slam 3, which took place on 5/20/1994. One of the biggest events to date. The aforementioned Macho Man Randy Savage will be in action for the first time for Smoky Mountain Wrestling against BRUISER BEDLAM. And this is one of the big events. It was interesting how they portrayed it. They filmed it, and then they kind of split it up on their TV. Mike and I talked about this for ECW. They did a lot of this, showing this on their local television, but not in one fell swoop. They use it to kind of continue to hype things up and get the live crowd introduced to maybe wanting to see the show. If you see it pop up with this big crowd on your screen on the local TV, it wound up being something that I don't know. It was definitely not this big pay-per-view premium live event type of event that they probably would have done today.
Yeah, and I think that just kind of lends itself to the size of this promotion and the time. They're getting distributed different channels based on which region of the country they're in, and there's really no platform for them to do to air this as like a pay-per-view setup. So I mean, yeah, it was kind of weird when we were going back and watching. I'm like, oh, they split this between two TVs, but it's is what it is. You got to get your product out there some way. But yeah, definitely compared to today's standards and way we run pay-per-views, very, very odd setup.
Yeah, we talked last week a lot about the penetration, for lack of a better word, of the television product and lack of eyes on the product. And you wonder if this would have taken place today, would it have the ability to continue to get over if there's going to be an old school promotion with a money backer or anything like that to keep them afloat? And what would something like this do in a market today? And I asked you that question. Like, do you think a Smoky Mountain Wrestling, if it surged up today with the clamoring and appeal of the old school fan, do you think a Smoky Mountain Wrestling type of promotion could exist today and thrive? Or is it something that should be left by the wayside?
I think it could definitely exist today. Thrive would be hard to call just based on the overall saturation of the pro wrestling world right now. There's so much pro wrestling, but I could see a promotion like Smoky Mountain Wrestling doing really well set up on its own streaming platform, similar to like how Ring of Honor is with Honor Club. If it's something that's kind of a niche product that somebody would, you've identified an audience for it. You can sell it as anywhere from a $2 to $5 a month subscription. I could definitely see it having some success there. The only thing that I would think would hurt it would just be, kind of like it is being any smaller promotion these days is, you kind of get lost in the sauce when you've got WWE, AEW, Impact, MLW, all these, larger, and GCW, like all these larger promotions that are running shows. I mean, there's not a weekend of the year where there's not some big show for a wrestling promotion. So it's just kind of hard to compete with that level of saturation.
Yeah, we're fresh off of just this weekend. We're just talking about you were a guest this week on Wrestling Tonight, talking about the crazy weekend between Triple Mania, Collision, Slammiversary, and then GCW was in New York on Friday. Like, man, there was so much to talk about that you're right. I think a promotion like this probably could do well if there was someone willing to, hit the peaks and valleys and ride the wave that is professional wrestling and lose money when it's possible. And I think that's kind of what we're seeing with Smoky Mountain Wrestling. They never quite break the bank. They never quite have this explosion, but there's moments where there's a lot of memorable things that age really well over like fine wine. On the roster, you go up and down the list, whether it be the guest appearances of guys, the aforementioned Jake the Snake Roberts, Macho Man Randy Savage, like Lex Luger popping in last week, all that tied with the future stars of wrestling with Chris Jericho and Lance Storm, Chris Candido. Like those guys really anchor this. And over time, like whiskey in a barrel, man, it gets better and better and better and better when the roster matured and went on to do legendary things and still are. That's the insane part.
Yeah, 100%, man. I think it would be cool if somebody had the money and the time to try to set up some sort of Smoky Mountain revival. I'd watch it 100%.
Absolutely. But, I think would have to have the man with the plan behind it. It would have to have Jim Cornette. And if society's ready to welcome back into the wrestling world, maybe they are. And maybe they try to do this, or, maybe this is something he never wants to touch again. And it's kind of like reigniting when WWE did the ECW reinvention, which, you wouldn't have WWE's fingerprints on it, but nothing like the real thing, the authenticity of the time and place of Smoky Mountain Wrestling from this time, from 93 to 95. It lives in this lore. And I think a lot of what is so good about it is what happens today when we're watching it right now. With that being said, let's get to the happy hour and talk about what Dave Meltzer has to say in May of 1994.
Happy hour.
All right, Dusty's war cry. That means it's time for happy hour. Let's get our drinks ready for and set the news and build some context for May of 1994. And of course, we'll get into June. But let's start with the first newsletter of May, Colton. 5/2/1994. Meltzer leads in with Smoky Mountain Wrestling. Brian Lee and Chris Candido. They won the Smoky Mountain Wrestling tag titles from the Rock and Roll Express on 4/23 in Johnson City. They continued. They announced a special dream match where the fans could vote any singles match they wanted. And apparently they were confident enough that Morton would get the loudest cheers, which they did. When all the faces came out, they did nothing to stack the deck since they had booked Morton versus Candido as the dream match. When the heels were scheduled to come out, Candido didn't, and they dragged him kicking and screaming and basically made the fans would vote for him as Morton's opponent. We continue. Morton won the match, but after the match, Tammy Fitch sprayed perfume in Morton's eyes, and Candido gave him the pile driver. which is the killer move in Smoky Mountain Wrestling. And Morton was carried out to the dressing room. Fitch then demanded the tag title match take place immediately. We saw the title change hands when Lee dropped Morton first on the top rope for the pin. A lot to break down here. Brian Lee and Chris Candido kind of came into our psyche as far as the tag team goes when we saw the Heavenly Bodies leave the promotion after their feud with the Rock and Roll Express. They're now sitting here with the tag titles. Let's talk about them first. Putting the titles on them, right decision on your end. Do you feel like this is something that is just a reaction to we have to figure out a good heel tag team to have against Rock and Roll to draw the house?
Yeah, I mean, obviously there's big shoes left to fill with Heavenly Bodies leaving the promotion. You got to have a heel tag team. I think Brian Lee and Chris Candido had the potential to be a really good heel tag team, but I feel like this might have been a little rushed as far as putting the straps on them at this point. And I think we kind of see that kind of play out with the way that they're kind of received by the houses going forward.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think a lot to be said about them trying to figure out, and this is what ECW dealt with as well when their roster was being pillaged by WCW and WWF at the time. They tried their best to keep the surge going and the momentum going, and you have to fill that hole on the card. And I think that's what they recognize. Lee and Candido as a team, they work for me, but I think you said if you would have gave them a little bit of time to get some more heat behind them, if say they had another month or so to build a feud with Rock and Roll and then do the title change, then I think it would have worked better. Going back to the pile driver here, we see this move and we talk very extensively about the moves and risk taken in wrestling. The pile driver is something that is kind of taboo in this promotion. When it's done and the effectiveness is huge, we watch when the pile driver gets given to anybody and executed, it elicits a huge reaction. I'm not sure if there's a move like that exists today. I mean, you can go to the Tiger Driver 91. That kind of got everyone to gasp. But this is something that Smoky Mountain Wrestling is known for, that certain moves are banned. We had that list come out from AEW earlier this week about certain banned moves or needs to be approved moves. But what are your thoughts on that as far as old school stuff goes and lack of pile drivers? That was the same thing in WWE as of a couple of years ago. We weren't even allowed to have a pile driver. So when CM Punk and John Cena did it, was a big deal.
Right. And I love seeing a pile driver, but I also completely understand why a promotion would want to shy away from them, just because given there's been countless injuries from people taking a pile driver. And it makes a lot of sense for a promotion this size to just be like, hey, you know what? We're not doing that, because your talent pool, although you've got some good talent, you're still a relatively smaller promotion, still relatively small pool. You can't really afford to be having your bigger names taking risky moves like this and losing them, because then what are you going to do to put butts in seats? So yeah, I mean, I get it, but it does, I also wonder how much of that is a promotion kayfabeness to an extent, like, coming out and saying it's banned, and then that gives it a little bit more notoriety. So when you do actually see it, it gets that gasp out of the fan.
Yeah, I agree, man. And there's something to be said about the small things get such a big reaction in this promotion. And there's a lot of times we have not mentioned once, aside from really the ladder match with Candido and Smothers, work rate at all. It's not really been about work rate. It's about promo. It's about storytelling in the ring. It's about all the other things that go into making the magic of pro wrestling, where you mentioned before, the pile driver is banned, and everyone understands, like, if the pile driver's hit on anybody, it's the end of the match. The guy is even, might be paralyzed, taken out to the back, neck brace, the whole deal. So when you hit anything on the neck or a move that's very similar, you live in this environment where it's brutal. And, on the opposite side of the spectrum here in AEW, where you have all these moves, they're near falls. You get the Poison Rana, is just a setup move. You have moves that are absolutely insane. And I guess it's a school of thought where you have to consider what you like best. And I know a lot of the old school traditionals fans will look at stepping up to the live crowd for AEW, even WWE sometimes, when they take these risks where near falls are for, the DDT was a move that was devastating. When Jake invented it, it was absolutely lights out. Now we have guys kicking out of moves that would probably, I don't know, make people like pass out watching them in 1994. The stuff that Vikingo and Omega did last night, Triple Mania, was a near fall. So I guess it's just two schools of thoughts about what is the appropriate way to watch your wrestling.
Yeah, it's the fact that the DDT is now pretty much a transitional move you're going to see in almost any match, and it's one of my favorite old interviews with Jake the Snake Roberts was I can't remember who the interviewer was, but somebody asked him what DDT stood for, and he said the end, which is one of my favorite things I've ever seen in pro wrestling. But yeah, I mean, it's just a different school of thought. Like, seeing somebody kick out of a Canadian destroyer still kind of blows my mind, but we see it pretty regularly. You'll watch an episode of Dynamite and see 3 or 4 Canadian destroyers within an hour, and it used to be this move that would just absolutely blow your mind. Same with a Code Red, like you said, Tiger Driver 91. So yeah, it's just kind of interesting how the times have changed, man. You know, you get used to seeing the same things. You kind of got to add more and more and more to get the same reaction out of the crowd that you've gotten in the past. So I imagine though, like anything, we'll eventually see kind of the horseshoe effect, where we'll eventually get to a point where we're seeing less. The trends will change, and it'll go back to the way it used to be, to where some of these larger moves are a little bit more protected, and not used as often.
Yeah, and you can watch things like we watched the resurgence of the bear hug with Mark Henry, where Big Show was doing the punch for a bit years back, probably a decade ago at this point, where you can make certain moves have this reverence with certain guys again. But I think you're right. We see moves that were lights out, match over, and of course, people have kicked out of the stunner before, but the stunner for Stone Cold was usually the end of the match. Now it's used as a setup move. We see Darby Allin do it sometimes, or we see other guys use it as a jawbreaker. Owens uses it as a finisher sometimes, but it's not as protected. I think it's just the nature and the cycle of wrestling moves where it becomes part of someone's repertoire. And the DDT, it has lost its luster unless, it's sold like death, like RVD sometimes, or Darby Allin can find a way to sell it to make it look a certain type of way. The pile driver the same way. I look at the pile driver, and we grew up through years with ECW and some of the more death-defying type of wrestling. There's a lot to be said about ECW's in-ring work, where we have guys taking risk right now and going to the next level over and over again with the DDT. So watching all this go on, it just makes you appreciate what they're doing here at Smoky Mountain Wrestling.
Yeah, especially, the risk these guys are taking, some of these talent are taking for sometimes a room of 275 people.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I mean, in a lot of ways, and I know probably Heyman and Cornette probably wouldn't get along in this way, but a lot of similarities between ECW and Smoky Mountain Wrestling in their dedication to their niche. Really, that's what it really is. And they kind of refuse to pivot from what makes them popular. And a lot of ways, what makes them popular is what prevents them from full growth. And it's so ironic that that's what kind of holds them back from taking to the mainstream, but they don't want to sacrifice their identity. Smoky Mountain being way different than ECW, but in a lot of ways, the passion's the same. It's about professional wrestling, the way they present it on their own stage.
Yeah, the same thing that makes them is also a blessing and a curse at the same time.
Speaking of blessing and curse, we have Prince Karras and Dirty White Boys, the other headliner outside of the tag team title program with Chris Candido and Brian Lee. Meltzer continues, nobody takes Karras seriously, so there's no drawing power here. And I believe his character has been done away with effective this past weekend. It's hard for Lee and Candido to be taking as a serious team because of the size difference, but it was pretty well necessary for this feud to ever get out of the blocks to get the Rock and Roll back in the Challengers role. Okay, so two things to break down. We talk about Rock and Roll. They're better in the Challengers role, chasing the titles. That is where they thrive. Certain people are good on the chase. That's very clear. Prince Karras, this exposure, this experiment for this mummy character. You and I had a discussion offline in between. We did some more research on Prince Karras, and I'll let you break down a little bit of why there is a mummy, because of the money man behind the scenes, which we didn't mention last week. And it's information that is not even a kept secret anymore, but it was a guy who was pretty much a silent owner behind Jim Cornette. He had certain things he wanted. So if we ever see something out of character, you could probably attribute it to the guy that's not Jim Cornette that's paying the bills.
Yeah, and it's something that we haven't brought this up on the show before, but something I was aware of when we started is that the famed music producer Rick Rubin who was a huge silent backer, well, somewhat silent backer of Smoky Mountain Wrestling. And I mean, it's to wrestling fans, I don't think it's a secret to anybody that he is still to this day a very open and avid professional wrestling fan. He was on, I believe, Joe Rogan's podcast earlier this year saying that he watches 4 to 6 hours of wrestling every single week and, just professing his love for it, which I think is awesome to see somebody in another, art form who's such a big fan putting it over. You don't get that. There's people all over the world that are wrestling fans, but you don't really see people who are elevated to that level putting it over that often. So shout out to Rick Rubin, being able to stand up and do that. But yeah, man, he was the money man here. And I'm not sure why that hadn't crossed my mind yet. I think mainly because just in my research, I'd never really read anything about Rick Rubin's involvement other than he was kind of, for the most part, a silent financial backer. So it kind of makes sense now. I remember you and me and Mike going back and forth the last couple of weeks, like, who the fuck okayed this mummy? Like, who wanted this mummy? And, studies show it was Rick Rubin wanted a mummy real bad. And, if you're putting up that kind of money, man, you're going to get what you want. So I'm glad Prince Karras existed. It's given me a lot of joy looking into them cutting off his thumb was enough to make it worth it for me during an interview segment to prove that he was a mummy. Was just there's not much more professional wrestling at its most absurd than that segment right there. But yeah, man, it's shout out to Rick Rubin for loving this thing so much, to loving this business so much, to put a bunch of money into a promotion he really has no expectations for, and putting all that faith in Jim Cornette.
Yeah, you can kind of trace throughout the history of wrestling. It's been tied with music. I mean, you can even look at the surge in the late 80s with WWF and the rock and wrestling. And what took it to the next level might have been MTV and everything. And that's coverage for another time. And maybe we'll get there at some point. But I think a lot to be said about just expecting what you want. And I give them credit for at least trying the Prince Karras thing. Obviously it's against their wheelhouse. They don't want to do it, but they did try. And you mentioned before, it was entertaining. They put some effort and some production into it on their end. And it's not something that holds up over time, but you can imagine, they did try their best, and it was something that they steered away from, which is admirable as well. Instead of just continuing to steer the car into a corner and not be able to push through, they did 3-point turn and went the other way, and they pivoted because they understood it wasn't working. And at least they could tell Rick Rubin, we tried, dude. It's not hitting with our fans. It's not drawing. We need to get people in the seats. And, a wrestling mummy, it's not often that will have an effect. But we see Wrestling Frankenstein that works for Impact Wrestling right now at PCO. So these universal monsters, there is a time and place. We had a vampire one time with Gangrel. We can make our own universe of these types of guys. I mean, I guess you could use George Animal Steel. He could be the Wolfman, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah,
so these universal guys, I don't know. There's something really cool about the Universal Mummy. So I understand if you're a fan of those type of horror movies, that's really a badass thing. But I don't know, it didn't translate into a wrestling world, because how the hell are you going to beat a guy who's undead? That's also it puts you in that position. But make the argument about the Undertaker, I guess, right?
Right. Yeah. I mean, I've always been partial to the Creature from the Black Lagoon myself, so I'm not really sure how you could work him into a promotion being, half fish, half man. But yeah, man, it definitely makes it, the Rick Rubin tie-in definitely makes that make a little bit more sense. And I'm excited to see as we continue to go through 94, if we see any other slightly out of place gems or storylines that we might be able to attach to Mr. Rubin.
Absolutely. And we have Smoky Mountain Wrestling planning on peaking its angles for August to coincide with its fan week from 8/5 to 8/13. And the 8/5 will be called Night of the Legends in Knoxville, which will be a slamboree type of show, bringing back the biggest names to work Knoxville. So August 6th will be a luncheon with the Faces and the annual Fire on the Mountain show in Johnson City. 8/7 will be a card billed as the Battle of Beckley. 8/8 will be a television taping. 8/9 will be an afternoon barbecue cookout with the Heels. 8/10 will be a Q&A session with Jim Cornette, Heavenly Bodies, Candido, and Fitch. 8/11 will be a wrestling show as part of a local county fair. And 8/12 will be a card called Knox County Knockout in Barberville, Kentucky. And 8/13 will be a wrestling training class with Tim Horner and a King of the Mountain singles tournament in Morristown, Tennessee. Man, for a week, packing the schedule, great stuff. This reminds me of StarCast. This is well ahead of its time, man. An afternoon barbecue cookout with the Heels. You get a luncheon with the Faces. This is as close as you're going to get to the Stars, where they were doing some of the breakfast things on WWF's end where you can interact with the fans, but a week-long excursion for a wrestling fan, this is a dream come true.
Yeah, man, that's the first thing I thought of, was like a territory level StarCast. And honestly, doing it at this level with this, amount of people sounds honestly way more badass and way more intimate than what you'd see at a StarCast today. I can't imagine going to a barbecue with Dirty White Boy and fucking Tracy Smothers. It sounds awesome.
This is what wrestling has become. And I think they were well ahead of its time, 30 plus years ahead of its time, where the new kayfabe is working the intelligent fans and bringing them close to the product. And that's what the fans of wrestling nowadays want. They want a way to be closer than ever with the product, not just ringside. They want a way to see their favorite stars of wrestling up close and personal. And this is something that they were doing in 1994. And there's nothing more personal than sharing a meal with these guys and taking a trip. And they're offering packages with prices not yet determined, but they are going to be, the group regulars, where there's going to be people that are usually attending the shows, but it's going to welcome in a traveling fan base that are like driven, tied together by newsletters and their way of keeping communication. It's a wonderful thing that ties and connects the world of professional wrestling, that lifelong relationships have been molded over that. And we're attesting to this, where you and I would not know each other if not for professional wrestling, talking about really Smoky Mountain Wrestling right now. So wrestling continues to bring people together, and it was doing the same thing in 94.
And man, I'm really interested to see what the price point is on this as we go forward, especially, in 1994 dollars translated to maybe what this kind of thing would cost today. Because I mean, at a Starcast, man, I mean, this is going to be for all of this, for the week-long access. I mean, you're looking at well over probably $2,000 a head, and it's like, it'd be interesting to see, because they are in these smaller rural communities, what the price point was on it. Because I mean, Corny's a smart businessman, dude. He's not gonna price out his market for this. So I'm be interested to see what they end up charging for this.
Yeah, I mean, it's also similar to Jericho Cruise. I know people are like selling tickets for the one that's coming up in October, but it's the same one. I don't know how many they're up to now. It's like 3 or 4, but it's similar to this, where you're like sharing the deck and there's live shows, but there's also this, like, they're doing karaoke with Darby Allin, and like you see these guys on different levels. But moving to the 5/9/94 newsletter, we have Jake Roberts winning the Smoky Mountain Wrestling title, which we'll talk about during the Get Your Fix segment. But this was highlighted in the TV taping on 5/2 in Harriman, Tennessee. In the first or so, White Boy in the ring when Roberts showed up. Jake Roberts said he didn't want to wrestle White Boy because he was physically handicapped, which he's talking about the eye patch from Kendo the Samurai, which we'll talk a little bit about Kendo. He's kind of replacing what Prince Karras is doing. So now they move to a samurai, which is a little bit more. We talked about him last week, the presentation, and we'll talk about who is behind the Kendo the Samurai character during the newsletter here. But there's a lot to be said about this Jake Roberts and hotshotting the title of the Dirty White Boy well before the big show. I think they were just getting itchy. They wanted to kind of create a buzz and get the title on Roberts. And we'll talk about Jake Roberts at length here. And I listened to his Snake Pit podcast, which is a fantastic listen, by the way, about this time. It was a short episode, like 45 minutes. And they pretty much spoke about Jake Roberts was in a really tough spot. He had just been let go by WWF a year prior. He tried his hand at WCW. They let him go. He was having issues with substance abuse. And Smoky Mountain decided to take a risk on him. He was not right at all. He tried his best for 2 months to make it work. They cut some pretty memorable promos. Even that promo they spoke about, we covered last week, they drove to his house and just filmed it right in his living room. So they made accommodations to get Jake to work and put the title on him, because Jake Roberts in 94, even though he's a little bit past his prime, he's still a huge star in professional wrestling, and to put your title on means a lot.
Oh yeah, man. Absolutely. Especially in these, like Southern territories. I mean, Jake's a Georgia boy. So, I mean, he really resonates with the fans up and through, Tennessee, West Virginia, Kentucky, and Tennessee. It's a really big get for him, man. And I honestly, even though Macho Man's a bigger name at this point, I feel like Jake fits this promotion better. And, it makes total sense to me that, they're obviously going to bring a guy in that big, have him feud with your, at this time, your top white meat babyface. I mean, I don't know if I would necessarily call Dirty White Boy a white meat babyface, but he's a babyface nonetheless. It makes sense you're going to put the belt on Jake. I wasn't sure if I expected it to be this fast, but, the promos between these guys, I mean, we've talked at length about the promo from Dirty White Boy. I mean, it's people really, like, young and upcoming wrestlers should watch Dirty White Boy promos. The content might not be 100% relatable or a little bit dated, but his delivery and the way that he plays on the emotions of his fans is incredible. So yeah, I mean, these guys were making some serious magic together in 1994.
So Kendo the Samurai blew some mist into Dirty White Boy's eye, which is why he's wearing the eye patch in one eye. We now know Kendo the Samurai is Tim Horner, who was a WCW sort of enhancement talent as the Star Blazer. So he did work a little bit under this gimmick right now for Smoky Mountain Wrestling for a short period of time, managed by Daryl Van Horn, kind of to take the place a little bit of the Prince Karras thing that wasn't working out. Another thing to notice about Tim Horn, as I'm looking up his Wikipedia page, he had a brief career in politics where on May 1st, 2018, he was elected county commissioner in Hamlin County, Tennessee. So it's not an office he still holds today, but we always talk about Jesse Ventura and Glenn Jacobs and maybe eventually Dwayne The Rock Johnson for president. Tim Horner, Kendo the Samurai, was doing his damn thing in Tennessee in this area for a time, just making decisions in the landscape. And there's something to be said about the crossover music in wrestling, but also politics in wrestling, because a lot they're one and the same in a lot of ways.
Yeah, man, that's pretty wild. Like the amount of crossover we see in politics and wrestling, I feel like speaks volumes about the environment that American politics. But I'll leave it at that.
100%. And we have Bob Armstrong talking about those pile drivers that we were referencing before. He was talking about them doing it on the program, and to even heighten it as well, they said the next pile driver in Smoky Mountain Wrestling is $2,500 as far as a fine goes. So every time you hit one, it's going to cost you some money. So and again, when it gets hit, it has this huge moment where we see them carry somebody out. Now you have the financial tie to it. So when it actually happens, it just shows how much the blood feud has taken to the next level. We're not even looking at the money. $2,500 in 1994 is a huge amount of money compared to today. So, which I'm sure the inflation, we can figure out the rate, but crazy. The pile driver stuff, like we take for granted that the sometimes simplistic nature of putting together a match can help future matches on the card, because there's a lot of shock value, So let's move to the first newsletter in June here, 6/6/94. We have Lance Storm missing both shows as he's moving from Calgary to Knoxville. He's making his home near Smoky Mountain Wrestling. Jericho teamed with Tracy Smothers one night against the tag champs Brian Lee and Chris Candido, and the next night worked a single match against Stephen Dunn. The reason I posted this on here for the newsletter is seeing Lance Storm commit moving from Calgary to Knoxville, and this shows that he's in the long haul with Smoky Mountain Wrestling, wants to make it his home. We know Lance Storm goes elsewhere and has bigger and better things to do, works every major promotion, pretty much in wrestling, like go from ECW, WCW, WWF, guys working as producer in Impact now. The guy's been all over the place. But this shows the commitment on his end as a young wrestler to say, I'm going to move as close as possible to promotion. I'll take as many bookings as I can.
Yeah, man. And not only the dedication it shows, but like, dude just got married. Like he's been married for, I think, less than 60 days at this point. Like went back to Calgary to get married, and now moving him and his new wife to Knoxville, Tennessee, which I've not spent a ton of time in Canada. I'm really in the Calgary area, just driven through. But I imagine it's a little bit different than Knoxville. So there's definitely got to be some sort of culture shock and adjustment there. But yeah, I mean, the guy's a consummate professional. And I think that this, his willingness to do that, especially at this point in his career, probably really set him apart from some of his fellow wrestlers.
So they're talking about this angle, and we'll talk about this on the show, where Smoky Mountain Wrestling, according to Meltzer, did a great job with the dressing room action involving Dirty White Boy and Dirty White Girl after White Girl had been giving the DDT by Jake Roberts. The angle went over so well that someone in the building called paramedics, who when they got there were pretty adamant about taking her in for treatment. So wrestling is best when the lines are blurred here. When people ask about Smoky Mountain Wrestling and Jake Roberts' time there, they think about him giving Dirty White Girl the pile driver, which was unheard of in 1994. We see a little bit of the rough play with Elizabeth during the Macho Hogan feud, where she's tossed around but never directly given a move. So to hit a woman with a DDT, as we mentioned before, with this reverence for the move, this was a really big deal, and it got people in the area, similar to like that WCW 1996 angle where NWO they lawn darted Rey Mysterio into the production truck, and you had actual police and paramedics show up. That's good. That's good publicity, and it shows your wrestling angles are resonating with the fans, and people are believing what you're doing.
Oh yeah, I mean, I'm sure this turned some stomachs, man, in this crowd. Like just the fact that the notion of violence against women at the hands of a man should never be committed, and for a move like you said, so at this point in time, the DDT was about as devastating as it gets. I mean, maybe second only to the pile driver. So yeah, pretty dastardly shit coming from Jake the Snake Roberts, which is exactly what we brought him in for.
Absolutely, and we have Brian Lee is going to be transitioning out of into the WWF. He's being signed, and we'll know that he's going to work 1994 SummerSlam as the fake Undertaker. That's coming up soon, and they're going to be a little bit confused because they're going to tape in bulk, and he's going to have his blonde hair, but then he's going to work some Smoky Mountain shows on the build up to SummerSlam with the black Undertaker-like hair. But he's going to be working most of the summer before going full time to WWF. And Brian Lee's another guy who has a pretty long career outside of the company, has a significant time in WCW. I don't know if he ever really blossoms to what everyone expected with the size. I don't know what the peak of his career would be. Maybe it's his feud with Taker as the fake Taker. Maybe it's this time in Smoky Mountain Wrestling. But, Brian Lee gone too soon as well. He's another guy that we've lost in recent years. But Brian Lee is another guy being pillaged. They cherry pick him from the roster, and Smoky Mountain Wrestling has to just move on. And that relationship with WWF, even though that's going on, I guess they'll be more giving about letting him finish up his dates, but it's still got to hurt because he's a main guy. You just put the titles on him tag team wise after losing the Heavenly Bodies, and you got to move on without him.
And prior to that, I mean, he had this huge run as the heavyweight champion of Smoky Mountain. So, yeah, I mean, that's got to be a little, yes, you're going to the bigger promotion, but that's got to be a little humbling to come from being the top heel and then the top heel tag team to Imitation Taker. That's got to be a little bit of an adjustment to make for your ego there. But, I mean, good for Brian Lee, man, going on to bigger and better things as far as promotion size wise and exposure to audiences. But, guy was great look, great size. Like you said, gone too soon, man. A shame we didn't get to see more out of Brian Lee in the WWF.
Just want to correct myself. Brian Lee is still alive, so I don't want to eulogize Brian Lee. I'm not sure why I thought he was gone, but yeah, he's 50. I just looked it up. So I was like, I thought for sure he wasn't alive, but no, Brian Lee Harris is still very much alive. I apologize. He's
sorry, Brian.
Yeah. So he's 56 years old in St. Petersburg, Florida right now, chilling right now. He's been retired since 2014. We saw him in Impact for a bit. So my bad, Brian Lee, but yeah, either way, leaving Smoky Mountain Wrestling 19-4 is a big deal for them because they're losing a top star. So moving to 610-94, with the exception of the 520 Volunteer Slam in Knoxville, business has been really weak for the group over the past several weeks. And Meltzer says in some ways that may not be nothing to panic over since Cornette expected to do little business in May or June, which correlates with their business ups and downs from last year when the same situation occurred. Although maybe not falling to the level, some of the spot shows have done less than 150 paid, and the company's financial situation at one point being shaky. So we've talked about they're building up to this Volunteer Slam. They're circling on the calendar. And as far as attendance goes for these shows, we looked at that WWF Marietta show last month that we talked about extensively here on the episode, the second episode of this season. They're not doing the numbers you'd expect for bringing in the stars. And I'm not sure what the paydays are for WWF and what the working relationship financially is, but you would expect a guy like Lex Luger, a guy like Macho Man to draw bigger houses than they are. And they're just not. I just think the crowd is the crowd here in Knoxville, and it's always going to be. You're not going to draw those outside fans from outside areas because you really have zoomed in on who your market is. And that's kind of holding the growth from taking place.
Well, and it's also too, there's just not, they don't have the benefit of today of being able to reach as large of an audience. It's basically, you're seeing it where it is. You're not, you're going to see it on the channel that it's on. There's no internet distribution, there's no smartphones, no targeted ads, anything like that. So yeah, I mean, they really, in some of these towns with the population size, man, even though they're small numbers, what we would think, it is kind of impressive for some of them just because, you're going running towns of populations of 4,000 or 5,000 people. You got a crowd of, or you got a house of 500 folks, and hell, that's 10% of the town, man. That's, nothing to balk at, but it's just, kind of, I think also partially the curse of where they were set up in some of these smaller towns. And it's just not as, it's harder to get your message out to an audience at this time. And also just kind of where they're at as well.
Absolutely. And the other thing that Meltzer mentions in the newsletter is they're expecting to do big business in early August and major shows booked. We mentioned that fan week they have going on. They're expecting that to be a major uptick in business. But the real concern is the talent that's exiting the promotion. Brian Lee, as we mentioned before, will be gone for good by the end of the summer. He mentions Chris Candido is expected to get a shot at All Japan before the end of the year. And it's a matter of time before, Tracy Smothers getting significant time in Japan. And we have Well Done back in WWF. And Chris Jericho of the Thrill Seekers has WAR tours. And little do they know, Chris Jericho will be off to ECW, then WCW, then Never Look Back. So trying to fill these holes as these guys are exiting, that's a similar issue that ECW had that we covered in 95, where you watch guys like Dean Malenko, Eddie Guerrero, Chris Benoit get pillaged from here. And even guys like Rey Mysterio, you had WCW just taking the best of the best, and you're left trying to fill the holes in your local market. And it's tough. It's tough to do business this way when you continue to build someone up, make them a homegrown star, and then they leave the promotion for good. It's just, it's not a successful business model. Even if you have a relationship with the big fish with WWF, they're still taking some of your talent. It's not going to help your local gate. That's the problem.
Right. I mean, it was effectively the death of the territory system as we knew it, was these, larger promotions being able to take the cream of the crop from anywhere and everywhere. And unfortunately for Smoky Mountain Wrestling, these up and coming guys, I think, left so fast that even if they were getting new people in the door, they just couldn't backfill these openings fast enough.
So Meltzer also talks about Bruiser Bedlam, who they're looking at to be the next big heel. Meltzer says not sure the spot he's being pushed for is the one he should have and the one he's ready for. Meltzer continues, the loss of the Heavenly Bodies to WWF devastated the heel side of the promotion, and they haven't recovered yet from it. The loss of Brian Lee won't be as significant, but it creates another major hole. Jake Roberts only works the major shows, and as strong as he is on interviews and as smart as he is in the ring and creatively getting heat, this has been a company built around strong work in the key matches, and Jake is out of shape and can't work. Continues because of how thin the young talent have gotten. It's hard to come up with heels that would be effective and top in this environment, and even harder to find ones that would be viable in the company's tight budget. And one wonders how many more times they can bring Bob Armstrong out of retirement before the gimmick stops selling tickets. A pretty strong indictment on what they're doing here. I think he's dead on, aside from just really, I mean, it's 94, so we got to take that into account. As far as work rate goes, it's not really about that, in my opinion. We're watching this. I haven't seen more than one or two matches that kind of pop us. That might be the selfish nature of us in 2023. But watching a promotion lose talent as rapidly as Smoky Mountain was, it's reminiscent of ECW, and it winds up having them take a hit. It's hard to fill the holes as they pop up, and you wind up pushing guys that are not ready, similar to Bruiser Bedlam, a guy like Kendo the Samurai, who's Tim Horner. It's not a gimmick that's getting over, but you're forced to put him in big spots that maybe fans are just not ready to see them there.
And having to accelerate storylines that need a little bit more time to marinate, like we said earlier with Brian Lee and Chris Candido, probably a little early to put the belts on them. I mean, that was a hell of a kind of a crazy finish, doing not only getting a pile driver, but then also dropping Ricky Morton on his neck onto the top rope afterwards. Like, that would have been a great thing to pay off after an 8-week storyline, but we really kind of just fast forward to it as soon as we get these guys together.
So going to the 6/20/94 newsletter, another thing people really recognize from this time when Jake Roberts had Smoky Mountain Wrestling was him shaving his head. And this is the episode we talked about. Jake Roberts showed up with a do-rag on, then took off the do-rag to reveal his bald head, courtesy of his last visit to Mexico. And according to Jake Roberts and Meltzer here, Roberts said his new haircut was to throw Dirty White Boy off, but really it was from getting an immediate payday in Mexico in a hair versus hair match where they paid him up front. And he said, I'll shave my head for any amount of money. I forgot the exact dollar amount they gave him, but cash is cash. And the guy with, hurting for cash and wants the money up front was willing to do whatever it takes. And they made it work. He kind of looks a little bit more badass here. Didn't know, you mentioned before, I wasn't sure how it was going to work, but it kind of did for Jake Roberts' character. And he continued to make it work. And he showed up on TV. No one was questioning Jake because macho head games or whatever toward Dirty White Boy.
Yeah, man, it's, hair versus hair match against Conan. Man, I would love to go back and be able to see that. That's awesome. But yeah, when we first saw this, I was like, oh my gosh, Jake Roberts, one of my favorite wrestlers growing up, and also somebody who has a similar hairstyle to mine. I'm really worried about seeing him bald, but yeah, he came out looking like a tough SOB with it still, man. I mean, you pretty much do anything to Jake. He's still going to come off as a pretty cold and dark heel.
So they're trying to play Tim Horner up as not being Kendo the Samurai. So they're doing some of the Blue Blazer stuff they were doing in 98, where they would have someone come out while Owen Hart was there, so they can at least have this illusion that it's not the same guy. So they're doing that here with Tim Horner, and they're having this babyface Kendo the Samurai show up, and it's someone that Jake met in Tijuana when he was in Mexico named Scott Studd, who's a Georgia independent wrestler who said to look good in his limited role on tape. So Meltzer says apparently Studd was in Tijuana with Jake at Triple Mania watching over Jake's money since Jake got his money in advance to shave his head during the time he was in the ring. So Jake hired him to just stay guard with his out front cash in Mexico, knowing that while I'm in the ring, I can't watch my money. And it got Scott Studd a booking here in Smoky Mountain Wrestling. And just interesting story here where they had this relationship where I just imagine Jake, smoking a cigarette saying, watch my money, kid. And Scott Studd was like, any bookings for me out in Smoky Mountain? Yeah, I'll take me with you. We'll put you under a mask.
Yeah, stuff. That's awesome, man. Like you said, we didn't know the exact dollar amount for this head shaving match, but it had to be decent enough for Jake to feel like he needed to have somebody watch over the bag while he's in the ring.
I would say so. I mean, cash is cash. So, and cash is king sometimes. So Scott Studd was the holder of it. Imagine what would have happened if Scott Studd, the young poor kid, if that money would have went missing, Jake Roberts would have shoot DDT'd him on the floor. But we have Jim Cornette announcing he's forming a union called FITE, which is called the Federation of the Intimidators, Thugs, and Eliminators. And he's the union leader. Bruiser Bedlam was the dock boss. Killer Kyle was the enforcer. And Dory and Terry Funk were in charge of the Amarillo branch. So they're going to be trying to do this fight, whatever program here. And again, this is in my opinion, looking at it, trying to make Bruiser Bedlam, surround him with stars, surround him with guys that can talk for him, and surround him with guys to make him look better than he is. Tale as old as time, trying to get a guy over that is just not ready. And they give Bruiser Bedlam every opportunity to do it. It just doesn't work for me.
Yeah, no, me either, man. As much as I want it to, that claw finisher is just the drizzling shits. It's not for me. But I love this fight. And every time I use the fight app, that's what I'm going to think of now. It's like, oh, Federation of Intimidators, Thugs, and Elimination.
I love it too. So they're trying to cut costs, and we saw guys get let go. I believe Bobby Blaze was let go last week, and what appears to be more of cost-cutting measures. There have been a change in pay scale for the wrestlers. So it gives us a little bit of perspective about what they were making for these tapings. A lot of guys have been earning $150 per show, which has been changed to $400 per week, regardless of the number of shows, with 3 to 4 shows scheduled each week at this point in time. So it's more often not that less money, but it would have been under the old scale. The faces all make extra money working the gimmick table, and some of them share their gimmick money with the heel they work with. Interesting. You don't really consider that. And independent shows are based on selling shirts and selling stickers and whatever gimmicks you have at the table. You don't consider being a good heel. You don't really sell anything. The way that works is like sharing your tips at the end of the night because if you are a good babyface, you're only as good as the heel you're working with. And I like that they're sharing with the heel. You never really think about that perspective because those heels, they're not selling t-shirts, especially in this time. They're not selling any gimmicks. So seeing the faces rock and roll, exchanging money with maybe the Heavenly Bodies when they're not able to sell shirts, it's an interesting concept that probably resonates a lot with older fans.
For sure, man. And it's nice to see the solidarity among the wrestlers. Everybody's got to eat, man, especially when times are tough, and sharing wages a little bit there because this is long before the NWO. No heels are selling t-shirts like they're hotcakes. So yeah, that's I don't know, man, the 3 to 4 shows a week. If I was working 4 shows, pulling 600 a week, and then you cut me down $200 a week, that would be tough to swallow. But I mean, if you're, like somebody like Bobby Blaze, who they just cut, I mean, where else you going to go at this point? You kind of got to take what you got.
So I'm going to do an inflation calculator just for conversation's sake. But before we do that, I guess let's just talk a little bit more about the heels getting t-shirts. And you mentioned NWO. That's a great example of it, but it's hard to imagine even like when I was a kid watching wrestling during even the Attitude Era, it was hard to find t-shirts up until, maybe Triple H was the first really big heel in my mind that had t-shirts because you weren't able to go out in the early 90s and buy any of these guys. So when Hogan's feuding with Earthquake, there wasn't a lot of Earthquake merchandise. There is outside of now with the nostalgia after Earthquake has long gone. You get the Natural Disaster shirts where you can buy it on the WWE shop, but they weren't selling that at the gimmick tables in WWE.
The first one I can probably recall being sold in real time was probably Razor Ramon. And I think because, there's some, man, I've come across them. There's some all over print Razor Ramon shirts that came out in the 90s that I've got some friends who are in the vintage t-shirt game. And he had one of those and he's like, yeah, I had 2 of those. He's like, I sold one of them for $900. I was like, good Lord. I can't ever fathom spending that kind of money on a t-shirt, but it's pretty unheard of, man. And let's see. And Razor, I guess at times, even though he was the bad guy, I guess he probably did. He was so over with the crowd that it was probably, why that was the exception. But yeah, that's really the earliest one I could think. I guess you could say Undertaker to an extent too at different times in his career, but I don't know. It's hard to. Undertaker's a hard guy to classify. Really, even when he's a heel, he's not really a heel.
So looking at the inflation calculator, $1 is worth about $2 and change nowadays. So not a huge difference, but it is when you start working the numbers, what they're making weekly. And if these guys are working 52 weeks a year, and a lot of them are, and some of them are doing independent dates as well outside of Smoky Mountain, but just Smoky Mountain, if you were a guy getting $400 per week, which is a top guy, you're making about a shade over $42,000, which is not a lot of money in today's terms at all. Maybe in that area, but everything has gone up. And rent wise, everything is just, being a wrestler is hard. It makes you appreciate where wrestling is now, where these guys are making, triple digits as well. And some are over $1 million. Watch, like they looked at Randy Orton's salary and all that. Wrestling's come a long way, and you can thank guys like this who paved the way and put their bodies on the line, and they have a lot of damaged goods to show for it. But similar to like the NFL with like unionizing and finding a way to make the most money, these guys had to kind of take the lumps before it got there.
Yeah, man, there's no way to get here without paving the way for guys who were, doing it, like you said, for a lot less. I mean, gosh, I can't imagine putting my body through that for $400 a week.
So the final thing here on the 6/27/1994 newsletter, if Smoky Mountain Wrestling wants to alert readers in the newsletter, so he had contacted Dave Meltzer and said, please be patient when it comes to merchandise orders, particularly VHS tapes. Merchandise was left in a mess, and they've reconstructed and are trying to straighten out the mess. Deadline for registration for Fan Week, which is 8/5 to 8/13, is early August. So that's been inundating them as well with that's their excuse. They're trying to get ready for Fan Week. And you got to remember, the lifeblood of watching these programs is the local television. But for someone who doesn't get local Channel 14 in the Tennessee area or anywhere of the like, you're relying on these tapes to check out the stuff you've been hearing about in the newsletters or on forums or wherever you're getting your news. So them not getting their merchandise, again, I hate to continue to bring it back to ECW. There was a huge issue in 1995 with Paul Heyman and the merchandise guys with the T-shirts and the VHS tapes that you were not getting their orders, and they eventually fired the guy. And there was this huge discrepancy where the guy, Mike spoke very, very familiar with. I think he knows the guy or knew the story very, very intimately, where they eventually fired the guy and like put him under blast. And the guy is very outspoken about how dirty he was done with the stuff that he did and never was paid outright for it. So wrestling's crazy at that point, and merchandise was huge. And that's how you get to spread the word. You're not able to type in Smoky Mountain Wrestling on YouTube in 1994. You had to get this tape in the mail and pop it in. I don't know, something exciting about tape trading, but I'm glad we live in the world we do now with pro wrestling the way accessible as it continues to be. Definitely
a lot more effort at this point to try to get your eyes on stuff. But I mean, to speak to them, being backed up, man, I mean, it's all hands on deck getting ready for this fan week. I mean, that they're running this with a bare bones crew. Everybody's probably wearing 3 or 4 different hats, doing 4 or 5 different jobs. And it's just nature of the beast running a smaller promotion.
Yeah, and continues to be one of those things where if you're not getting eyes on the product, you're not finding a way to get people to consuming in any way, and you limit the exposure, you limit the growth, and the whole thing is one thing leads into another. But that's the newsletter for the last 2 months. Let's get into Get Our Fix, talk about the TV, all the great stuff we have on TV and the storyline progression. Let's get our fix.
Get your fix.
All right, here we are getting our fix. Smoky Mountain Wrestling TV. We're going to start with the 5/7/1994 episode from Clinton, Tennessee. We have 3 matches on deck for you. Smoky Mountain Wrestling Heavyweight Championship on the line. Dirty White Boy defending against Dark Secret. Of course, he retains. The TV Championship on the line. Bruiser Bedlam defeated Chris Hamrick to successfully defend his championship. And then we have Chris Jericho and Lance Storm taking on Well Done. So we mentioned Well Done is going to be their opponent going forward for some time. Jericho and Lance Storm are a young, promising tag team. They've been doing promotional videos for them, and they are someone they want to look to push. They're eventually going to hold the tag titles. They are someone that they see some star power in. But as far as matches go, 3 solid matches, 2 title matches out of 3. Some good stuff here on the episode to start May.
Yeah, man, most definitely. And I mean, what good dance partners for the Thrill Seekers is Well Done, man. Like 2 great teams. Really enjoy seeing their matches against each other. And yeah, they really starting off May with a bang. If you're really getting your money's worth, man, whether they're selling tickets for $6 or $8, getting 3 championship matches, that's pretty good shit.
So mostly on this show, it was hyping up the 520 show to get people ready for it. They have some good segments here. We have Jim Cornette and Bruiser Bedlam at the gym to prepare Bruiser Bedlam for the match with Randy Savage. They show Bedlam doing various workouts to put over his strength. And then we see another Jake Robert pre-tape comments regarding the heavyweight champion, Dirty White Boy. Roberts cut an awesome promo saying he can tell when someone's going to make it and when another isn't going to make it. Roberts mocks White Boy having an eye injury, and he says that the troubles for White Boy have just started. So the one thing you get from Jake, Meltzer mentioned in the newsletter that maybe the work rate's not there. Maybe he's out of shape a little bit. But, man, even though he wasn't completely, by his own admission, he wasn't completely 100% there, In a lot of ways, he was really struggling with his demons here at Smoky Mountain Wrestling. His promos don't suffer for it. The guy is still on his game, and these promos are some of the best you're ever going to see. Makes you care about a program that maybe you shouldn't care about, but you do because Jake's sitting there and targeting Dirty White Boy.
Oh yeah, man. Jake can talk to me about anything, and I'm going to be interested, man. I've always just his promos. He communicates such emotion at such a low volume, and I think that's something that a lot of like newer talent could really take away and learn. Is you don't always, especially as a heel, you don't always have to be screaming and yelling to come off as a bad guy. You know, you can say a whole lot more with less. And Jake's just, he's the poster child for it, man. He's incredible.
Absolutely. And we have the other thing is we mentioned the tag titles changing hands, and it happened on 423, but this is the first time the audience is seeing it. They show the highlights from Johnson City. We have Brian Lee and Chris Candido winning the Smoky Mountain Wrestling Tag Team Championships by defeating the Rock and Roll Express to win the titles. So this happened on a house show, and this is the first time fans are seeing it. I'm not sure how else they would get the news, but again, this is a way to catch fans up. And when you start changing championships on live events, and you can make the argument you bring people that want to be in person in Clinton, Tennessee, or wherever you're holding these shows, but it's also as a compilation to catch people up on what's happening to build them up for 520. And it's interesting because it happened a whole week prior and nobody knew. And that's the other interesting part we see about titles changing hands. And we said the same thing about WCW. When you tape in bulk for some of these shows, sometimes you are falling out of succession where you have to figure out a way to make it right. We talk about ROH all the time when we did the ROH show. When a title changes hands, like we had Willow showing up without the New Japan Strong Women's Championship, and because they didn't expect her to win it because of Mercedes getting hurt. And then all the TV was out of succession, even though they wound up taping 4 months or 4 weeks in advance, I should say. And she didn't have the title. And you have to try to do these consistency things, and they dub over the announcements and all that stuff. So some of the tapings aren't right. We also talked about the bleach blonde hair. Some of the promos from Brian Lee have the bleach blonde hair, and in the ring he has the black hair because he's getting ready for the Taker feud in the summer. So it's all, that's what happens. You tape in bulk.
Yeah, it's going to be super confusing as a fan, man, especially, coming in and you're like, oh, wait, I thought the Heavenly Bodies had these, or I thought the Rock and Roll Express had these titles. And then even more confusing, man, seeing Brian Lee with a totally different hair color. I mean, if I was just a, random blue collar worker in Clinton, Tennessee, I would think it was a different guy. But like, who the hell is this dude?
Right. Moving on to the 5/14/1994 Smoky Mountain Wrestling TV from Harriman, Tennessee. This is at the Roane State Community College. This was also taped on May 2nd. So I found the dates and the attendance for a lot of these places. 275 is what they did at Roane State Community College from Harriman, Tennessee. We had 3 matches on deck as well. Dirty White Boy defending his Smoky Mountain Wrestling Heavyweight Championship against James Atkins. He was obviously the winner. Bruiser Bedlam successfully defended his TV championship against Anthony Michaels. And we had that finish here. Jake Roberts had beaten Dirty White Boy in the main event to win the championship here. Again, taped on May 2nd, aired on May 14th. A lot to be said here. Pulling the trigger on 5/14 when your big event is 5/20. What are your thoughts on that? We talked about Slammiversary, that they had the Australia tour. We knew they weren't going to make any rash decisions. We talked about the Thursday Impact prior that, man, Deonna Purrazzo will never lose the title to Jody Threat. But we're watching it right here. You have this big program set up where you can have that moment where Jake Roberts beats Dirty White Boy on your Volunteer Slam, which is a big event you've been hyping, and you pull the trigger on a TV show 2 weeks prior. It kind of is, it's a wild concept to me.
It doesn't make any sense to me, man. I've been racking my brain trying to think, where was the justification to make this call? This is the match that you've been hyping up. And, the 520 show was a 2,000 person crowd. And this show at the Roane State Community College, that's 275 folks, man. You're talking about a 10th of the crowd there present. And for you to pull the trigger on it here, I mean, don't get me wrong, great promo, like the heat between Jake and Dirty White Boy at this show, where Jake's basically calling Dirty White Boy, saying he's a handicap human being and that he shouldn't be wrestling to begin with, and he doesn't want to wrestle somebody that's not 100%, but it doesn't really matter because Dirty White Boy's never going to be 100%. I definitely see, given Dirty White Boy's character, how that escalates to the point that he wants to have the match right now. I mean, he's playing mind games. It's what Jake does best, man. He's one of the best. early shades of a cerebral assassin in Jay. You know, I don't think we really saw anybody play mind games at this point in pro wrestling history better than Jake the Snake Roberts. And this is it to a T, man. But yeah, just a really, really weird decision. I mean, just for Harriman, Tennessee, just for context, at this point in time, I mean, it's a town of about 9,000 people, or actually, no, 7,000 people. And it's actually over time got smaller. It's just under 5,000 people today. But I mean, I imagine it was probably a pretty packed house. I mean, it's a community college center, so it probably doesn't hold more than like 350 people. So 275 is probably pretty packed out. But man, when you've been pushing this big show since the end of April, I don't get the decision here. It's maybe did they have to call an audible for some reason? But I can't see why. It just doesn't make any sense to me.
Yeah, it really makes no sense. And you're right, but we'll run through the show quick because it was the show was built around this angle, as you mentioned. So they opened the show with Dirty White Boy wearing the eye patch to open the show, defeating James Atkins. Jake Roberts came to ringside. He's drinking water, watching the champ in action, kind of sizing him up. After the match, Dirty White Boy confronted Jake Roberts at the announce table with Bob Armstrong, trying to keep them apart, saying, "This is the main event for our big show. Please don't get involved." Jake gets on the mic and says he's happy to see you getting, past your disability and being able to do this despite having this, the eye patch on and being able to work through it. Roberts says he would never beat a man who's physically or mentally handicapped. And he, doesn't want to beat White Boy up and wants him to be 100%. He goats White Boy into it where, at this point, we're about to get the match happening tonight for free because of hurting his ego. And it kind of makes Dirty White Boy look a little bit, I don't know, not as smart as you should as a world champion. And you get goaded in by a guy who is the head games. This is what Jake does. If you're looking in kayfabe land, this is what Jake came in to do. He's trying to take your championship. And after first of all, you're not 100% because of the injury with Kendo the Samurai. You already had a match tonight. It was a squash match, but you still were in action. And you're willing to put the title on the line despite Bob Armstrong telling you not to, and you still do it, and then you wind up losing. I think in the eyes of the fans, they probably look at him like, well, you kind of deserve what you got.
Yeah, but I think that also just kind of drives home 100% the character that is Dirty White Boy. Like he's a blue collar Southern fucking hothead, dude. And you get him going, and he's going to make stupid decisions. And I feel like that makes him all the more relatable to these crowds.
So we have the match, the main event, and it winds up going, decently long. Roberts is clearly out of shape and not the same shape he was in just months prior in his WCW run. So they make the best of it. And it's not about work rate. It's about the emotion elicited from the crowd. And they definitely have a lot of that here. They play up the eye, and White Boy tries to use, everything he can to stay on top of Jake Roberts. White Boy goes to grab Jake, but Jake uses the camera to flash into the champion's injured eye, which was a good spot here. Roberts then plants White Boy with the DDT. It's over after that. So this is also the same concept as we're kind of deconstructing it in our heads. Rock and Roll is better chasing the titles. Maybe they felt going into 520, seeing White Boy chasing Jake to get his title back, it would have a little bit more oomph to it to get people in the building. Maybe that's the way to look at it, where instead of having a challenger that is a dastardly heel of a guy trying to ward off this challenge, maybe having him chase Jake. But a week before removed, less than a week, 6 days before that big event, in wrestling logic, a guy, and if you believe it's real, then it doesn't matter the time frame. But when you see this happen, the title's not coming off Jake anytime soon, as long as he's willing to do business with the company.
Yeah, and first of all, really nice touch with the flash to the eye, because they'd already sold how light sensitive his eye that was hit with the mist from Kendo the Samurai was. Just really shows the level of smarts Jake has for the business, man. I thought that was a really nice touch. But yeah, man, I mean, you're right. This belt's not coming off him anytime soon. Interesting decision to make. But I think it does tell a little bit of a better story with Dirty White Boy. I mean, it paints him as an underdog, and everybody loves an underdog story.
And I think, having a big name like Jake Roberts holding on to the championship is a huge deal for SMW. He's still a great heel. He's great on the microphone, as we mentioned, even though his in-ring ability has been greatly diminished to this point. Doesn't matter. I mean, because he's still kind of in line with what we're seeing in the ring here outside of Rock and Roll and Heavenly Body and the Tracy Smothers and Chris Candido work rate. A lot of the stuff is being told with the stuff on camera and the promos being cut. And the simplicity of this match, we mentioned the light from the camera, and pulling off that Kendo come down the ringside, pull the eye patch off, and then work different moves like rubbing the wrists into the eye and then playing that the whole time. It reminds me of, and this is completely different, but an injured ankle from Eddie Guerrero at WrestleMania 20, where Eddie winds up winning the match. But there's something about, Eddie taking his boot off and nursing that ankle and like seeing his exposed ankle in an ankle lock without the boot on, and that the foot and ankle is hurt. Seeing exposed that way, it just has a different feel to the effectiveness of the move. And we see the same thing here when the eye patch comes off, and you can't help but wince because everybody's been poked in the eye. Everybody knows exactly what that's like. And you're just sitting there watching, Jake Roberts pick him apart methodically. And eventually, even though White Boy is admirable in his efforts, he is unable to overcome not only Jake Roberts, but Kendo the Samurai. There's a lot to be said about him falling out, and he's going to have to get back on the horse and figure it out just a week later. And will he be 100%? Probably not.
Yeah, probably. I would bet not.
So we moved to Volunteer Slam 3, Knoxville, Tennessee, the Civic Coliseum. This is on May 20th, 1994, and this aired on 5/28 on TV. So it featured Les Thatcher on commentary. So if you're looking to watch the Macho Man match, if you're something that is what you wanted to see from this card, it's on the 5/28, 1994 on YouTube or wherever you're consuming Smoky Mountain Wrestling. This is how you have it here. We had Tracy Smothers pinning Kendo the Samurai. We also had Chris Jericho and Lance Storm defeating Well Done. And we've seen them working the circuits together. We mentioned the match prior on the TV week. People are complaining that it's more of a squash match because even though it's not a squash match, it goes fast. And I think a lot of people that are like, oh, it's only 3 minutes long, it's a squash match. But the goal of that program with Well Done is to put Jericho and Lance Storm over and make them look like stars. And I think that's what they've been doing. They've been getting the wins all over the place. Jericho and Lance Storm weren't losing anytime soon.
No, and I mean, you can tell a great story in 3 minutes, man, especially with guys like this. And, we talk about the kind of absence of work rate in this promotion. Well, here's where it all was right here.
And we also had another match that had some work rate here. It was Ricky Morton and Robert Gibson taking on Brian Lee and Chris Candido for the Smoky Mountain Wrestling Tag Team Championship. Of course, Tammy Fitch is in their corner. It's a no DQ, no time limit match. Candido wound up pinning Morton after hitting him with Finch's perch, and Morton attempted a pile driver on Fitch just to kind of get people talking about what lengths will Rock and Roll take their efforts to get the titles back. And watching this, knowing that Brian Lee will be out by the summer, I think maybe people expected Brian Lee to lose, but no. Again, Rock and Roll is better on the chase up here, and this match was pretty good. No DQ. I don't think this needs a stipulation. We were talking very waxing poetic about the match with Heavenly Bodies and Rock and Roll going these marathon matches, most falls in an hour. And apropos as it might be, we saw almost an hour match, 2 out of 3 falls on Collision on Saturday, just last week between FTR and the Bull Club Gold. And goddamn, I feel like we willed that into existence. We were just talking about it. And that's tag team wrestling the way that I think Jim Cornette and everybody will be proud of, at least Smoky Mountain Wrestling inspired.
Yeah, I'm interested to hear what Cornette's thoughts are on that match this coming week. Because it was absolutely incredible, man. And hopefully we did have some impact on getting it, putting that out in the universe, and then getting it delivered to us. Because man, what a banger!
So also on the 5/28/94 TV is that other match talked about for Randy Savage at Volunteer Slam 3, taking on Bruiser Bedlam. Jim Cornette's in his corner, and they're putting a lot behind Bruiser Bedlam being the next big heel in the promotion. Bob Armstrong's in the corner of Randy Savage. We had Bruiser Bedlam getting the win here, and we had seen this. I saw in the results prior to watching the match that he was going to get the win. I wanted to see how, but of course it was not done in any clean way. We had Bruiser Bedlam hitting him with brass knucks after Dory Funk Jr. appeared at ringside late in the match, attacked Armstrong. He shoved Savage off the top rope. The ref bump kind of set the stage for all of this. After the match, Bedlam and Funk double teamed Armstrong until Savage made the save. So Savage was able to hit Funk with, moves as well. So he took a loss, but fans were kind of let home happy where we had a little bit of Savage clearing the ring, even though despite his loss. And it's weird seeing Randy Savage in this ring, especially the lack of production, the lack of pomp and circumstance for a guy like Randy Savage. Just seeing him just 5 years prior was at WrestleMania 5 in front of all those fans and as the champion and everything around him. And even what he goes on to do after this year in WCW, it just shows the damaged goods that WWF thought he was. And it's so crazy to think about because he had so much left in the tank, and WWF they could have made other stars with him. And think about the beneficiary of Macho maybe taking on Bret Hart at WrestleMania 10 in a title capacity instead of like Lex Luger or something like that. Even 95, if he would have stayed. And 96 too. Think about 96 working with Shawn Michaels and the rub you would have got from that. Like, I know they've worked in a different capacity, but watching him do a job for Bruiser Bedlam, I can't help but just be disgusted by the booking of Randy Savage because of the legend he is. It's awful to see. And, it's cool to see him here, but I wasn't expected to see him portrayed just as another guy. You never want to see Randy Savage portrayed as just another guy.
Right, man. And really interesting. I guess just the only way that Randy agreed to this was just because he was put on the shelf at this point and he really wanted to work. I mean, it definitely seems really out of place to see him at somewhere like the Knoxville Civic Center, and then especially putting somebody else over. I will say, if you're going to put a guy like Bedlam over Macho Man Randy Savage, at least you didn't do it clean. At least there was, shenanigans, brass knuckles, outside interference. I feel like at least in that way, Macho comes out slightly. He's protected in some way with that being the finish. And like you said, with him clearing the ring at the end, gets the crowd to, kind of see what they're used to out of Macho Man Randy Savage at that point. But yeah, really out of place, really sad. I mean, yeah, it is kind of sad in a way to think of. I would love to be a fly on the wall for that conversation between Jim Cornette and Macho Man Randy Savage, like talking about how this was going to go down. Because we know that Macho Man was not historically the easiest guy to produce or work with at times. So, man, just really, what does this say about where his head was at to take this deal?
Yeah, and it's a tale as old as time in pro wrestling. We watch Ric Flair be very open about his trials and tribulations with his ego and lack of confidence that kind of took a hit, especially in his run with Eric Bischoff taking over creative in WCW. And I think Randy Savage at this point, and he hasn't really spoken on it, but I know he was very bitter about not being looked upon as a gemstone in the WWF catalog as far as stars goes, because he is, to me, the 1A, 1B to Hulk Hogan in the build up to all the major WrestleManias that put WWF on the map. And to see him in 1994, not too far removed, while, and of course he sees Hogan only going to sign with during these months, debuting and signing with WCW with a huge money deal. The writing was on the wall that they look at WCW as this place where all these older wrestlers go to end their careers. But in a lot of ways, 30 plus years old is not an old wrestler. He's able to give more. And the work rate we're seeing from Randy Savage, he still has a lot more to give. And it's just a shame to see him here, where even WWF at the time, the working relationship, they're sending guys over, but they're not. Randy Savage being sent over is a big deal, but it's not a big deal in their mind because it's just Randy Savage, the announcer, the guy on Monday Night Raw, which is insane to think about. But we got to put it in perspective of 94. He's not in a main program going past WrestleMania. He just wrestled Crush in a Falls Count Anywhere match. He's not a guy that's in the title picture. That's insane to say, but that's what he's looked at as a mid-carder, a little bit above that. Right.
Yeah, it's kind of just wild to think about, knowing how we all view him as fans. That's where he was at this point in his career.
Yeah, and I've been saying it since the WCW season. I'm just bitter that we never got a moment to let him bask in the response on the WWE side of things, where he never got his chance to come back and kind of mend the fences like we had with Ultimate Warrior prior to their passing. And it just sucks. Like we're getting the posthumously awards and everyone buys the merchandise and the figures are coming out and all that stuff. But I think hopefully Randy Savage knows how beloved he was at wrestling fans and how much he meant to wrestling fans and what he meant to pro wrestling as the entertainment value. Because when you think of pro wrestling, you think of a guy like Randy Savage, and seeing him here with the dim lights of the Knoxville Civic Center kind of spoke volumes about how WWF was viewing him and as far as his stock goes. But, I'm glad he went to WCW, and there's not a lot of guys you say you're glad they did X, Y, and Z. I'm glad he went to WCW and had his resurgence run, because they treated him, even though the storylines were disjointed sometimes, they put the title on him. He did stuff there. He was, treated as a main eventer in the ring, and that's what he was looking for.
Absolutely, man. And I mean, like you said, his contribution to the business at large and just like entertainment in general. I mean, you've never watched a professional wrestling match in your life, and you know who Macho Man Randy Savage is. And some of that's just from his larger than life personality. Some of it's from the Slim Jim deal, which he wouldn't have gotten the Slim Jim deal if he didn't go to WCW.
True.
So there you go. Yeah, continued to become larger than life by going to work for Turner.
Absolutely. And our main event here was Jake Roberts fighting Dirty White Boy to a no contest after the referee, Mark Curtis, was knocked down accidentally to the floor. Jake Roberts tied Dirty White Boy to the middle rope. Roberts pulled out a snake bag with the Dirty White Girl running out trying to help. Roberts grabbed her by the hair, teased hitting her with the DDT, and then ultimately dropped her with the DDT before sliding his body across her. Fans go deathly silent in the ring. Tracy Smothers and others ran out to clear Roberts while everyone was just like looking at the situation at hand. Dirty White Girl being laid out with the DDT. We mentioned this in the newsletter. We had paramedics being called. This was a huge deal where this angle, I think a lot of times we get overstimulated with wrestling, and we got, especially in the Attitude Era, where you watch, go down the list of all the females taking bumps. Stacy Keibler taking power bombs through the tables by the Dudley Boys. ECW side of things, all those women, Beulah is just getting put through tables in 95, 96. But this was, man, especially in this area, you put your hands on a woman, and it spoke volumes to the angle, and it still resonates today. Just, you could hear a pin drop in the arena, and Jake Roberts comes across as a real creep, man. It reminds me of a lot, and you can see Randy Orton was watching his tape when he RKO'd Stephanie in the build to that Triple H match. I think it was WrestleMania 25, I believe, when they main evented, where he's doing that psychotic gimmick where he was doing and crawling across the ground, slithering like a snake. Jake Roberts literally slid his body over the top of her. It was pretty gross to watch, but resonated even all these years later.
Yeah, pretty unsettling visual, man. And, I mean, Jaws had to have just been on the floor in that crowd. If this had been, if somebody, if a lesser wrestler, like just some local guy had done this to Dirty White Girl, not being a name that fans recognize or a name that fans probably feared. Like, if you pulled this off, you just been Bobby Blaze or somebody doing this shit, you probably would have been stabbed or shot by the fans present. Like, it's just, really, really big impact for the time. And, I mean, that's, like you said, is exactly why they brought Jake in, was to do stuff like this.
So we covered that in succession, but we want to double back to the 5/21/1994 TV. This was like the day after it was filmed, but technically the go home on their end. So it's confusing how things are taped in bulk, but this was taped also at Rowan State Community College, attendance of 275, Harriman, Tennessee, as you mentioned before, population about 7,000. We had 3 matches here. Tracy Smothers defeated Chris Hamrick. We had Bruiser Bedlam defending his TV championship against Brian Logan successfully, and Ricky Moran defeated Chris Candido by DQ. Most of this stuff here is building up this feud between Bedlam and Smothers going forward. Bruiser Bedlam's looking for a challenger. Tracy Smothers stepping up to the plate. And this is another person you're feeding to give Bruiser Bedlam to get him to be a spot where you feel like you can't fault them for doing it. They're trying their best to get him over as a heel. Jim Cornette being the golden goose here. He has the microphone next to him. Cornette says right now Bedlam can beat up any wrestler or truck driver. So good promo here. And, at this point, Bruiser Bedlam retires after 5 successful defenses and gets $5,000. So his title is now vacant, according to Jim Cornette. We know that's not going to stay true because he's not going to stay retired. It's just kind of macho head games that they're doing here. Bedlam attacks Smothers with a pair of brass knuckles. And then we're going to see this feud take off for the TV title, Tracy Smothers and Bruiser Bedlam. But this was just really building up towards this feud. And then also we have the tag title stuff going forward we had Candido and Morton having a one-on-one match, but this is to build up more of this tag feud between Brian Lee and Chris Candido versus the Rock and Roll as they chase for the titles. Morton says his belts were stolen from them and they're coming back. Decent episode. Some of the undercard programs getting attention, which was cool. But as usual, the in-ring work takes a secondary seat, and they're building up more stories for what will be their next bigger event.
Yeah, man, not a bad go-home show by any means. And really like the intensity from Smothers kind of stepping up as an opponent for Bedlam. I love Tracy Smothers, man. Guy looks like $1 million. His promos are great. And like I said, they continue to do a little bit of these, the secondary story promotion or development going into the big show.
So we have the 6/4/1994 TV show from Harriman, Tennessee, Rowan State College. And this is getting tricky because they taped it on May 2nd. And it's a whole month out. And this is after the big show, Volunteer Slam. So you got to keep all the storylines in the head, and then you got to keep true to what the booking was for those big events. especially the tag team championships. And Brian Lee and Chris Candido are still holding those belts. And if things got pivoted or something went sideways at that show, you already taped this a month ago, and I guess you can cut it and put it on the cutting room floor, figure it out. But they defended their titles in the main event, and they defeated Mike Furnace and Bobby Blaze. We had that vacant TV championship, so even though Bruiser Bedlam's not retiring, he did relinquish the title. I think that's the reason why they're like, how are we going to get this title off this dude? I guess he just relinquishes it. We had Kendo the Samurai winning it over Chris Hamrick to win the vacant title. We also had Well Done in Action getting a win against Brian Logan and Anthony Michaels, I guess, to make them a little bit more sustainable in a feud against the Thrill Seekers. And in our opening match, we had Rock and Roll Express defeating Killer Kyle and James Atkins. The main thing opened the show here was Tammy Fitch having a press conference regarding some of the controversies going on. She was talking about the boss of the team, Brian Lee and Chris Candido, and says, I am the boss of the tag team champions, and people may disagree, but I am the one making the decisions. This was really well done. And it was, we have Chris Candido and Brian Lee feeling a certain type of way about this, but she also says the other thing about the pile driver, saying that the pile driver match is ridiculous, and says Bob Armstrong wants them to lose the tag titles and a pile driver shouldn't be happening. She says that they will pile driver the Rock and Roll Express and anyone gets in their way, but we're not happy about it. So cool segment by Tammy Fitch, shows her range and personality that we'll eventually see down the line in her, but she's driving it here. And I kind of like the aesthetic with her taking charge with them.
I do too, man. I mean, like I said, we don't call her the first lady of Smoky Mountain Wrestling for without a reason. And she illustrates it perfectly here, man. She's, this point in her career, man, how things changed later down the road. But she really was great in this promotion.
So we have another Jake Roberts interview on this show, and he gets interviewed holding the championship. Says he's not going to take pictures with the Rock and Roll Express. He's the champion for a reason. And Robert says he was brought into this world by a woman and a man. He says there were mistakes made at the beginning of his life, and Roberts learned how to lie, cheat, and steal from his father and also his mother. And he said, I don't really have any regrets about what I did. Man. And he's still getting heat. Fans are reacting a certain type of way. And pretty good stuff here. Complete filler episode as far as in-ring action goes, but the Roberts White Boy using the TDT on the stuff, it's reminiscent of the Jake Roberts Randy Savage feud with their teasing it on Liz, but they never actually pull the trigger. They do it here, and that's what makes it a big deal, where Jake Roberts isn't just bluffing anymore, not playing head games. He actually pulls the trigger and does it on Dirty White Girl.
Yeah, and that's the difference here between Vince running a promotion and Jim Cornette running a promotion. I don't think at that point in time Vince was ever going to let Jake the Snake Roberts actually put a DDT on Miss Elizabeth. But yeah, man, it's ahead of its time for sure.
So we also have Brian Lee. He's off TV right now, and I think he's doing TV tapings for the SummerSlam feud, being the Underfaker, if you will, or the fake Undertaker in the 1994 main event. But Brian Lee getting some work over there. And like we said, he's going to go off and do other things for a long while. And he's still living, guys. So my apologies again to Brian Lee. But we have another taping here, 611 Harriman, Tennessee. Again, Roane State Community College is doing things in bulk, man. 611, they taped this on May 2nd again. Tracy Smothers defeated Brian Logan. Bruiser Bedlam defeated James Atkins and Chris Hamrick in a handicap match. And Kendo the Samurai defeated Dirty White Boy by countout to retain his TV championship. So Dirty White Boy is kind of gunning for other championships. Jake Roberts is still gunning for him. Jake Roberts cut another promo on this show and says everyone can look up to him and idolize him, beating Dirty White Boy. Jake says that White Boy needs to wake up. He insults Dirty White Girl as being someone who's a lot of miles on her and a lot of cars parked on top of her. He says, I enjoyed hitting the DDT on you. And he suggests that if Dirty White Girl had her way, she would come back around for another drive around the block with Jake Roberts. And obviously, Dirty White Boy is not happy about that. And Jake Roberts gets involved in this main event for this TV championship, which eventually winds up getting him counted out, where White Boy can't get up after being decked with the championship from Jake Roberts, and Kendo gets the rub by beating a former world champion. But, Jake Roberts getting mental hunges, and they're extending this feud past. And you can imagine if Jake was to stay with Smoky Mountain Wrestling, he was going to continue to give the rub to White Boy and everybody else he touched in the programs. It's a shame that eventually he got, in his own way and refused to show up. So this is going to be the last we pretty much see of Jake before he starts no-showing events.
Yeah, man. Like, as if he couldn't be despicable enough in this storyline, man. Just those comments about Dirty White Girl. It's some pretty rough shit, man. Especially in 1994 to be saying in some of these more rural Southern conservative communities. Like, you definitely getting some old school heat here for sure.
So to end the show, we had Dirty White Boy being interviewed, and he cuts a really impassioned promo, and he says his mother told him he would have to fight the devil one day, and he says maybe that's the time right now. White Boy says that when he makes loves, he wonders if he's man enough for his wife, and like if I can't beat Jake after everything he said about her, I want to make sure that she's proud of me and I'm someone that she can be protected from. And White Boy says his family will not be ashamed of him going forward, and good promo, man. It's not even about the title anymore. It's about respect. It's about family. It's about everything else. And I'm really impressed with Dirty White Boy's ability to sell this seriousness, the edge of this feud, and how much that the mind games are really having an impact on him. You're seeing it's getting involved in his personal life. It's involved in his professional life where he can't focus on the ring. Of course, Jake Roberts did hit him on the outside of the ring, but he's distracted. Like everything going on with Dirty White Boy, there's a lot to be said about. They're taking the impact of this whole cumulative feud, and it's having an effect on Dirty White Boy. It's wearing him down.
Yeah, man, it's really interesting development here. You know, White Boy never cuts a bad promo, but we get to see this kind of more emotional side to him here, which I think is great. I mean, it just makes him even more relatable. I mean, the guy's already an incredibly relatable character to the audience, but you know, getting a little bit of a peek into his psyche here and how these mind games have affected him. That yeah, man, like I mean, he always puts on a strong front and kind of a hothead front, but I think it's incredible storytelling here that he's showing the cracks are showing a little bit here, and that it's absolutely affected him and is fucking with him for sure. So yeah, I think it's I thought at this point in time in 1994, this is very much a men don't cry society, and I think it's pretty awesome that White Boy's willing to kind of show how this is affecting him mentally and continue to go deeper into that story.
Absolutely. And I just want to, highlight Dirty White Boy as far as being featured. And of course, he got the attention of WWF during this time. And about 2 years later, he would be joining the WWF ranks, but not under a circumstance that anyone really could be proud of. He joined under like a series of jobber gimmicks. If you guys remember TL Hopper. So some of you guys know that he is TL Hopper, and he was a jobber in WWF. And that gimmick was never something you can get out from underneath of. It's a jobber gimmick. It's something that he were never going to be, never featured on a WWF pay-per-view, never able to cut a serious promo like anything he did as Dirty White Boy. Yeah, great. It's just because I always look at him and I'm like, man, Tony Anthony is his shoot name. And you look at him and you're like, you see a lot of what was great about him here in Smoky Mountain and watch him on WWF. If you are conditioned by only watching WWF, you would know him as TL Hopper. You're like, what's the redeeming qualities of this guy? He's just a jobber, but the range he has, you watch the emotions he's hitting here. And yeah, if you only know him as TL Hopper, I beg you, come back and watch some of the stuff, because the promo he's cutting they're magical. He never has that opportunity here. The new generation with the series of jobber gimmicks given out, like Duke the Dumpster Drozy and everything else that went on in the new generation that's being waxed poetic about now, but new generation still sucks in my mind. But I don't know, people, there's this rejuvenation of love for new generation. I don't understand it. It's not a good era of wrestling, but I don't understand. I don't know how you feel about new generation.
I mean, I think it's got its points that were all right, but yeah, I think it is. I think it does often get looked at with through rose-colored glasses by a lot of folks.
So we're moving on to the 6/18/1994 Smoky Mountain Wrestling TV, and this was finally taped a little bit later. Smoky Mountain Wrestling at Loudon, Tennessee, Loudon High School, 400 in attendance. This was taped a week prior on June 7th. So do you have any information about Loudon for us?
Yeah, so Loudon is 36 minutes southwest of Knoxville. So basically, like today would be considered part of the Knoxville metropolitan area. So basically a suburb. And so this crowd was 400 people. Like I said, it's a little bit closer to, a little bit closer to Knoxville than Harriman was. I mean, not by a whole lot, really, about the same distance. But there were 4,000 people in 1994, and they're about 6K today. So yeah, 400 people for a 4,000 person town. That's a pretty good showing.
So in Loudon, Tennessee, they saw 3 matches here. Nice, neat package of Chris Jericho and Lance Storm defeating Chris Hamrick and Larry Santo. The heavyweight championship on the line. Jake Roberts defeated James Atkins, in pretty much a squash match. Tracy Smothers defeated the Beat the Champ champion to win the title. So Tracy Smothers wins that championship that we thought he would probably get from Bruiser Bedlam. They cut the middleman out. They stripped Bedlam of the title, or he dropped the title, and then he beat Kendo the Samurai. And now we have Tracy Smothers holding some gold, which I think a lot of people in Tennessee were happy to see.
Oh, hell yeah, man. The wild-eyed Southern boy with a gold around his waist once again. It's good to finally see that.
So we also have more of this Well Done and Thrill Seekers feud. Well Done confronted Jericho and Storm following the victory that they had against Chris Hamrick and Larry Santo. Lance Storm pretty much just says they're fed up with Well Done complaining. Jericho has an idea to settle their issues. He says that my dad played hockey for 10 years. He did actually as a shoot with the New York Rangers. As we all know and love now, he has that great merchandise, the Jericho jersey that looks like a Rangers jersey. And it says, if you break the rules, you get into the penalty box. Jericho says, let's have a penalty box match where if you break the rules, you're put in a penalty box for 2 minutes. And those matches will take place in July for Summer Blast, setting the tone, building up towards the next events. We'll talk about those next week. But yeah, Well Done and Jericho and Storm. This is like the first entry feud for Thrill Seekers into the promotion. And the Thrill Seekers seem to get the one up on every piece here. And this is going to continue. I don't know if Well Done has I don't think they have one victory over the Thrill Seekers, and maybe they'll get it in the shows we cover next week. But I think we only see Well Done beat jobbers. And that's really I don't know. I'm looking forward to see Thrill Seekers spread past this Well Done feud and go elsewhere.
Yeah, same here, man. I mean, Well Done's a good team, but I don't see him going over the Thrill Seekers here at any point. This has got to be the first time that we've had a professional hockey reference in American professional wrestling, and I'm positive south of the Mason-Dixon line where we've had a hockey reference used in stipulations for a match.
And just watch how hot the Nashville Predators were when they run that cup run, man. Like, they love their hockey now. So
yeah,
it took a little bit, but there was a buzz there when they were in the cup, man. Like, there's something electric about being over there in Music City for hockey. So here we are with Jericho, and that he does tap into the history too, which it's amazing. Like, I would say Jericho is way more famous than his dad Ted Irvine is now, as far as the Rangers go. But at the time, he was leaning on his dad's kind of famous status of being a former hockey player to kind of get some reverence with the fans. And now it's the opposite way, where I think if you ask someone who Chris Irvine is, even in New York, I mean, no one really knows as far as the hockey players, but unless you're a diehard Ranger fan. But
right. Yeah, this is, I mean, at this point, four years prior to the Predators even being a thing. So yeah, nobody's even thought about pro hockey in the South yet.
Yep. So we have a video package recapping with the stuff we talked about with Brian Lee and Chris Candido. They're setting up this feud with Rock and Roll Express, and Morton says they're going to have a 6-person tag match with Bambi on their side, and Tammy Fitch is going to be wrestling on the other side. So we get some intergender wrestling and Smoky Mountain Wrestling, and we know that the men are not going to wrestle the women, but seeing them on the opposite side of the ring, still a concept WWE uses nowadays, and it's not a bad thing to have, especially to extend the feud past just the tag. I mean, at this point, they've been feuding for about 2 months, and we want to make sure it extends past this, because what other tag teams do we have until the Thrill Seekers are ready to take those titles?
None, man, none at all. So this is a good way for them to add another layer to it and keep it relatively fresh.
So we had another good segment between back-to-back. Dirty White Boy sat outside of a tree, and he's saying he's been thinking about a lot of problems, and all of them revolve around Jake Roberts. He says, I never begged anyone, but Jake Roberts has made me beg. And you see the emotion in his eyes, and White Boy begged Roberts to hit him with the DDT instead Roberts hit Dirty White Girl with the DDT. White Boy said, I've encountered a snake while outside, and I said that the snake will either bite you or slither away. He knows that Jake Roberts likes to play mind games, and White Boy wants to return the favor. I want to play mind games with you, Jake, too. White Boy says that he's eased up behind the snake. He grabbed the snake by the back of the head, and he said, I'm going to start acting like a snake myself. I'm going to be controlling the snake, and he says, you want to play games? We'll play games. And, I thought this was really well done. And again, going back to his time as TL Hopper, the Range was never given the chance, where he's just a occupational jobber. This guy, man, is making the most out of the situation working with Jake, even though Jake is not all there. He's, has his substance stuff going on, but man, he's making the most of it. And this is pretty memorable stuff, man.
Yeah, this is my favorite segment of the entirety of May and June, man. I like, we were talking on last week's episode, or on the episode prior to this Smoky Mountain Wrestling TV. we're really starting to see kind of the peek behind the curtain, see the more human side of Dirty White Boy here. And just the setting, man. I mean, it's just absolutely perfect. Tim propped up against the tree, sitting outside, being alone with his thoughts, going through, all the turmoil. And it's beautiful. Really, really well done.
So in the ring, we have Jake Roberts coming out for an interview. We talked about him being bald because he lost the hair versus hair match against Conan in Mexico. And Roberts says that if this was a battle of wits, I'd be fighting an unarmed man. So the fans are booing him. And Roberts says, when you run with the devil, you get to feel good when you want to feel good. And who knew how true that actually was in his real life, man? He was feeling himself right here. Roberts takes off his do-rag and says, now it proves what he will do to play mind games with White Boy. And he apparently, and it's cool that they worked in the hair versus hair match. There's no way of avoiding it when you see him. Doesn't have hair. Got the payday from his match with Conan at Triple Mania in Mexico. But I don't know how that, mind games are mind games. I guess you're willing to do whatever it takes to get in your head, but they played into it. Did it resonate with you? Do you think it played into the story where they shaved his head, or just a cheap way to get an explanation that he has no hair now?
I think it was just a cheap way to get a cheap way to tie it in, man. I thought, honestly, I mean, it shows that we've talked about it. Jake's referenced it himself. I mean, the wheels are kind of are starting to come off a little bit with Jake and his personal life here and his substance abuse. I honestly, I don't know if he would have been shaving his head, 5 years prior to this by any means. I mean, obviously, like you said, he's let go by WWF. A year or prior, tried his hand in WCW, didn't work out. I mean, guys got to be hurting for money. I mean, and he's an addiction cost a lot of money, and he's right now showing kind of his desperation, I think, here a little bit, that he'll really do anything for a payday at this point.
So we also have this backstage segment that Roberts finds Kendo the Samurai being tied up in a cage, and Roberts breaks Kendo free. They return to the ring, and all four men begin to brawl. So White Boy, Samurai, Jake Roberts, all getting involved. And then we get an interview, interesting enough, and Dirty White Boy is trying to make it sound like that he is playing games, and they're trying to lead up to this cage match that he wants to challenge Jake Roberts. That's why he put Kendo in a cage. I don't know. White Boy takes his eye patch off. This was all bizarre to me. The mind games that they're trying to play, and maybe it just resonates differently in a different time and place, but didn't have the same effect when he's trying to get to Jake's level. It just feels very contrived, in my opinion. I'm not trying to be too hard on it, but didn't have the same effect. I'm looking forward to the cage match they have with each other. We know they won't get there, but it was a good way to get there, I guess. But, Dirty White Boy makes sure he says, I owe Robert something, and he plans on collecting. And
yeah. I'm with you, man. This was a little bit of a reach. It was kind of weird and a little hard to follow. Just it was a shot they took and didn't exactly land.
We also see the reintroduction of this fight faction we talked about, and Jim Cornette and Bruiser Bedlam are trying to combat the Armstrong family. That's the main factor of this. And we have the biggest, baddest, roughest, toughest, according to Jim Cornette, Killer Kyle's the enforcer. They introduce him. Kyle has a different look now. He's wearing a bandana and jeans instead of his usual tights and the stuff we usually see him in. And this is the first time we see the fight faction. And I like that they angle it where he's just trying to combat, because we know the feud with Cornette and Bob Armstrong is evergreen. It just continues and continues and continues. And that's really the streamline. And Meltzer mentions they break glass if emergency for Bob Armstrong when they need someone to come out. They pull Bob Armstrong out. They know he's going to get a reaction. And this fight thing, it could help Killer Kyle take the next step. It could help Bruiser Bedlam. And that's the function of it. Sometimes factions can kind of hide the flaws. And I think that was the function of it here, where you can have this badass mouthpiece being Jim Cornette. And then it can help everybody having the support. We see how great factions can be for wrestlers as they come on the come up. And it's a good spin. We don't see enough factions at this time. It's nice to see them here. We saw how great factions can be for professional wrestling 2023, whether it be, the Bloodline. Imperium's a great one now. Go down the list as far as on AEW side with the Blackpool Combat Club and the Elite, all good stuff. But
House of Black.
Yeah, House of Black. Some great stuff here. But this is the same ilk. They're trying their best to hide a little bit of the flaws of the guys are trying to get over.
Strength in numbers, man. Sometimes you pair guys together, you rub off on each other, and kind of helps elevate some guys that are maybe having trouble doing it on their own.
So we have more of this Kendo the Samurai. Two guys were in the mask situation. The original Kendo the Samurai wasn't pinned in the main event. The other kendo came down. Smothers got the inside cradle on him, won the match and the title. It was a 3-minute segment in total, but there's a way to keep kendo from being pinned. So they allowed him to win the title despite not being the right guy who was the champion. Whatever. But I think at this point, though, the good part about this show, every match for Summer Blast was at least referenced in here, and it made for a really good episode. I mean, we got the new stable of Fight for Jim Cornette to combat Bob Armstrong. We also got, the good job of hyping up the Roberts and White Boy feud. We got the Express Lee and Candido feud. And even the under stuff, the Kendo the Samurai stuff and Tracy Smothers is good stuff as well. This was one of the better episodes, and they do their best when they finally have the culmination. They can look past the bigger event. We got past Volunteer Slam. We are looking towards another event, and setting the table is great. It's about how they finish it.
Yeah, man, most definitely. And like I said, the promo from White Boy here sitting against the tree was just cherry on top of the sundae, man. This was good stuff.
And our final TV of June, we have 625-94, Loudon, Tennessee. This was taped on June 7th as well. We had 4 matches. Scott and Steve Armstrong defeated Larry Santo and James Atkins. The TV champion, Tracy Smothers, successfully defended his title against Chris Hamrick. Dirty White Boy defeated Joe Cananza by disqualification. And Timothy Well defeated Lance Storm by DQ as well. So 2 DQs back-to-back. Another great interview by Jake Roberts regarding Dirty White Boy and the recent mind games by having his own Kendo the Samurai. Roberts says that White Boy's wife, though, she probably thought of it. And that's the way he volleyed back to him and said, okay, cool. But, it was probably not coming from you anyway. So I'll take it there. And he says, you could take a finger. I'll take your arm. And he said, poke him in the stomach. I'll rip out your heart. And says, I'm not worried about the cage match for Summer Blast. And he said, my father reminded me how to steal, lie, and cheat. And Robert says, how about you ask your wife how the DDT ride was for her, because you're going to get it at Summer Blast. Great promo. We're not going to see it because we're going to see him walk out of the company, which kind of sucks. But I think Dirty White Boy and Smoky Mountain Wrestling was better for Jake Roberts' short time as champion here.
Oh yeah, man, absolutely. I mean, this has been my favorite program that we've seen with White Boy so far. These guys make magic together. Some of the best storytelling with just babyface and heel pairing. Just good shit.
Jake Roberts then comes to the ring, attacks Dirty White Boy after Dirty White Boy's match with Joe Cananza, and Roberts stomps away on White Boy and chokes the challenger. Out comes Kendo the Samurai. He hits the wrong Kendo the Samurai with DDT, which happens to be the Kendo the Samurai that's on Jake's side. The other Kendo comes out. He hits Roberts. Roberts looks a little bit discombobulated, like, I can't believe I hit the wrong guy. Like, I was supposed to be in the driver's seat here, which is good selling by Jake here. And yeah, I get what they're going for here, where they each have their own Kendo the Samurai, but it's confusing as a fan. Like, I'd imagine there's fans in the building that aren't as familiar with what's going on, that a lot of it is not really explained well on TV. You kind of have to dissect it yourself and figure out what's going on. But I understand what they're going for, and I guess it did its job.
Yeah, it definitely did its job, but we understand it breaking it down to this level. But I could see being incredibly confused as a spectator in the crowd.
We had another Fight interview with Jim Cornette, Killer Kyle, and Bruiser Bedlam. Cornette makes reference that says that Bob Armstrong is a coward, and I want all of the Armstrong family out of SMW. He then talks about Tracy Smothers' match with Bedlam, saying the only way to win is to have opponent pushed out on a stretcher. Pretty cool. And we're going to look forward to that program. I like to see Tracy Smothers with gold as the TV champion. And Bruiser Bedlam's going to be involved in, I guess, a TV championship feud for a title he vacated. Maybe he doesn't care about the belt. That's not the function. He just wants to rid SMW of the Armstrong family and guys like Tracy Smothers, guys that they don't want in the company. And that is the function of it. But we also have Bambi interviewed by Les Thatcher in the ring, and they're trying to hype this up. She said Bambi said she's been a friend of Ricky Morton and Robert for a long time. And we get Brian Lee, Chris Candido, and Tammy Fitch entering the ring. And Fitch says that she's ran every woman out of SMW, and I'll do the same to you, Bambi. Brian Lee grabs Bambi. Out come Rock and Roll to a huge pop. Fitch is in the ring, sent in the ropes by Bambi. She's pulled out to the floor by her men, so we didn't get to see them locking up. They're teasing it for the bigger event in July. Morton says that Tammy put her nose in their business too many times, and this time Tammy will be in the ring with the Express for her last time. So they're at their wits' end here, and we're seeing Rock and Roll tease with their moral compass of, we know that they don't want to do what Jake did to Dirty White Girl, but they're damn close because they're sick of this chase for the tag titles and getting in the way. And That's why they brought Bambi in to even the odds. But I like this battle of conscience that Rock and Roll Express has, because there's such white meat baby faces here that at least you see like how much the titles mean to them, that there's a chance that they would have done something that they would have regretted.
And it just shows how fed up they are at this point, man. I mean, it's I really like the setup for this. I think this is going to be cool. And this will also be the first time that we've seen Tammy Fitch in an official capacity competing in a ring. I mean, she's gotten involved for sure. She's gone after Dirty White Girl. She's, jumped on the back of Dirty White Boy, but like she's actually going to be an in-ring competitor in a 3-on-3 tag match.
So in this main event here, Lance Storm lost the match by hitting Timothy Well with a closed fist. The ref calls for the DQ. Closed fists are so lame, man. I hate, I don't know. It's a discretionary thing. I understand that. Don't know the function of, especially in the main event segment of a go home show. But I would say though, I mean, the Candido and Lee and the Express stuff has gained a lot of steam. The Roberts and White Boy stuff has improved and feels very personal. And unfortunately, Roberts won't be around for a long period of time. We won't get really all the juice out of it, but at least we have these memories to go by.
Yeah, I mean, what we got out of it was absolute gold, man. It's like you said, unfortunate we don't get the final payoff, but what we got was just doesn't get much better.
Absolutely. And as we look forward to next week, of course, we're going to break it down in the Chaser and preview it, the Summer Blast 1994 on 7-1. So we're right there, man. It's next week. This was the go home TV. So they did a lot of laying the groundwork for it and making sure people are excited. And I got to say, I'm pretty excited to cover it next week.
Yeah, man, me too. I think this is going to be a really fun, big event for them. I can't exactly call it a pay-per-view, but yeah, this should be a good one.
All right, let's get to the Chaser, and we're going to pick apart our favorite part and talk about our favorite part for the last 2 months of Smoky Mountain Wrestling. A lot of content we just gave you guys, and let us know in the chat what you think your favorite part was about watching Smoky Mountain Wrestling in 1994. Let's get to the Chaser.
The Chaser.
All right, here we are for the Chaser, and every week, as we mentioned, we'll pick our favorite part. Let's start with you, Colton. What was your favorite part that you pulled away from these 2 months that we covered extensively here of Smoky Mountain Wrestling 1994?
Dude, my favorite part of May and June has got to be hands down the backstage segments and interview exchanges between Dirty White Boy and Jake. I mean, it's just fantastic storytelling, man. It doesn't get much better, and I think probably my favorite one was the White Boy promo against the Tree, talking about how, and it kind of drew a parallel with me, where something we've seen recently in AEW, where, the storyline with Chris Jericho versus Adam Cole, where he handcuffed Adam Cole to the ropes, and, Adam Cole was begging him not to hit Britt, and just, this, it's a tale as old as time, man. And it's a really good way to, pull at an audience's heartstrings. And, I've been a huge White Boy fan this whole ride, but getting to see, peel back a little bit and see this more human side of him was really, really fun. I really enjoyed it.
Man, I have to agree with you there. I think that's probably the best part that we pulled away from this. The personal touch to this feud isn't just about the championship anymore. And it's so unfortunate that we're not going to get the cage match between these two that was so built up with Dirty White Boy and Jake Roberts. And we'll cover it next week, but Jim Cornette replaces Jake Roberts in the cage, and it doesn't have the same oomph. And they make the best of a situation, and the rest of the card kind of goes off what's built really well, and they figure out the title situation, which we'll cover next week. But Jake Roberts leaves him in a bad spot by no showing. And from all conversation after the fact, Jim Cornette and Jake Roberts were fine. They worked again when Jake returned to WWF a couple of years later, and Jim Cornette was working there as well. There weren't any issues between the two of them. So, Jake was in a bad spot, admittedly, in his life. So I'm just appreciative we got these 2 months of Jake here. And, lost in all this was Macho Man as well. And I know we kind of talked about it at length, but, just want to reference again just how wrestling has changed as far as perspective goes, where, he's sitting at not even 40 years old and looked at as a dinosaur in the wrestling world, where he had so much left to give and could have helped the generation of WWF. But as you mentioned before, we got a lot of great stuff in WCW as well. And I know everyone leans towards their fandom, whoever they were watching at the time during the Monday Night War, they're partial to. But, selfishly watching during the time where he left, I would have loved him in WWF, and imagine what he would have been if they used him appropriately, and keyword being if if they used them appropriately throughout 1998, 1999, what that would have looked like, and the opponents. And imagine wrestling Stone Cold Steve Austin and The Rock and having Macho in the landscape. We just covered WWF 1998 extensively, and doing the butterfly effect of what Macho Man Randy Savage would have been. And you can make the argument, like, even if Bret Hart didn't leave in 97, like, would there be the star power that they had? Because that vacuum of star power, it doesn't happen unless these guys leave. Same thing with Hogan. I think if Hogan and Vince stayed in bed together for the remainder of their career, I don't know if we would have had the boom in wrestling if they didn't have that split. And that's a fun kind of thing to fantasy book and talk about. But I guess things worked out the way they were supposed to. But I have to say, watching Randy Savage as a guy with his confidence hurting here in Smoky Mountain Wrestling wasn't fun to see. It was nice to see him here as we got to take a stop over and visit through our time traveling machine. But just makes me yearn for him to be appreciated in these years while he's here and able to wrestle and entertain us. And they just weren't doing that in 94.
Yeah, it just hurts your soul a little bit to see him at this level, and, you know, see him putting somebody over like Bruiser Bedlam in the Knoxville Civic Center. It's just really kind of sobering thing to think about. But, you know, at least there was another chapter for him. But yeah, it's just still hard to believe that was the mindset behind that, man. It's hard for me to totally buy that Vince is just like, oh, he's past his prime, he's over the hill. I wonder if there was something else going on there, creative differences, something like that. Like, or if he was, you know, we do hear that Vince likes to punish people for shit. You know, maybe it was something like that going on. I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
But it's, yeah, just wild to think that, like, especially when you see these guys, you know, because he went on, he had many more years of his career where he could still go, you know.
Yeah.
It's wild to think that they were like, all right, yeah, we're going to hang him up and put him on commentary. And no disrespect to him on commentary, but, you know, I enjoyed him a lot more in the ring than I did at the announce booth.
Oh, absolutely. And the thing is, too, we talked about it at length for season 3. Work rate is secondary in 1998. And so it's not like, it's like, oh, well, he's embarrassed himself in the ring. He's better than most of the guys they are highlighting in the ring in 1998.
Yeah, 100%.
So it's just bizarre to think about. And, you know, it's nice to see him here in the stopover, but that's the last we're really going to see him. He had a few matches on the live event circuit in that area, but we won't really get to see him. Maybe we'll see some other familiar faces, Smoky Mountain Wrestling. I know we're going to see some next month with the Gangsters making their debut in August, which I'm really excited for. But let's get into closing the tab as the lights come on the bar. We're going to preview next week, talk about what else is going on in the Tavern, preview everything else going on in the debate, you know, all that good stuff. Let's close the tab.
Closing the tab.
All right, as we close the tab and get ready for next week, we'll get our weekend started here. Next week's show is going to be episode 4 of season 4. We are more than halfway through this journey through Smoky Mountain Wrestling 1994. It will air on 7/28/2023. We're going to be covering all of July, all of August in Smoky Mountain Wrestling, including 3 huge events. Smoky Mountain Wrestling Summer Blast 1994, as we referenced before. It's supposed to be Dirty White Boy versus Jake Roberts. We won't get that, but we'll also be covering the Night of Legends on 8/5. Fire on the Mountain on 8/6, everything going down on Fan Week, talk about that luncheon, the barbecue with the heels, all the good stuff. And we're going to make the announcement soon for season 5. And we have the graphics and stuff ready. And I want to break down the episodes and let you guys know how many episodes it's going to be. I got to figure out all the way it falls out, but it took a different turn. It kind of came to me in a vision. I was like consuming some nostalgia based product. I'm like, this would be cool to cover. This is going to be cool to cover. And all of it came together pretty quickly. And shout out to the One Bad Chat, man. He always turns around the graphics and makes them look really sweet. We couldn't do it without him. And it looked great doing it here on audio. And if you guys listen on video, and if you guys listen to us on audio, you guys see that great picture with the wood panel. It's the vision I had for this. And I just appreciate everything Chad does to take the Tavern to the next level. Because, you know, when you click on this, you know, it looks beautiful.
Oh yeah, man. He never disappoints and always delivers.
So let's preview what's going on in the Tavern. We got obviously the debate. We also have the flagship coming up on Thursday morning. You and I brace for Impact, breaking down the fallout of Slammiversary Thursday for Impact on Access. We got all the other stuff coming up too, man.
Raw down on Thursday.
Yeah, a lot of good stuff in the Tavern. But preview, get your stuff out there at mullet.mania and talk about what's going on in your world.
Yeah, man. Follow me at mullet.mania on Instagram. I've been on the debate here and there this week, filling in or not this week, but filling in the last couple of weeks. So debate show, always love having a great time. Also got to be a guest on Wrestling Tonight coming up this week. So thank you guys for having me on, talking about the fallout of Impact Slammiversary.
Last week.
Or last week, my bad. Oh, shoot. I've got my timelines.
Dude, come on next week,
across.
whatever. Just make it right.
Right. But yeah, man, I had a blast being on last week talking about Slammiversary and also previewing the Ring of Honor card. Man, I'm like Jake hitting the wrong samurai here, man. I'm all sorts of discombobulated.
Yeah, man, it's been a blast covering this, and like I said, we're gonna make the announcement of our next season, and it's gonna be something unexpected. It's gonna be somewhat out of our box as far as what season 5 is, and I think you guys are gonna enjoy it. I'm definitely gonna enjoy covering it. I started watching it at length, and I was like, why am I watching this without doing the work and covering it? I think we should just hop on here and do it. And Chad popped open the graphics. We got him in the group chat yesterday. I was really excited for it. But make sure you guys check out everything on the Turnbuckle Tavern. We're gonna do some shilling there. Make sure you guys go to theturnbuckletavern.com. Go to Spotify, Apple, give us a review, leave a 5-star review. If you do, send me a message or a screenshot with it. I will send you whatever, man. You guys want stickers? I have some stickers. I've been chilling at VPW last weekend. I was there and I met some fans there, and we were talking about professional wrestling, shot nostalgia, some people giving us some love for it, selling my trading cards at VPW. So thank you to Victory Pro Wrestling for allowing me to set up my promotional table there. And also, guys, go to remarkablewrestling.com, pick up your tickets for Own the Night. You know, hopefully Chris Sabin's good. He'll be there. Alex Shelley's going to be there as well. We got Kevin Blackwood taking on Desmond Cole in Desmond Cole's first title defense, which is going to be awesome. September 16th, Deer Park, New York. So hopefully it's cooler than the last time, man. We were sweating in that last one that we just had at Space is the Place, which, man, I almost died on those lights, dude. I was sweating. So I appreciate you guys coming out and during the heat, man. What an event. Oh, the also thing, we also had our Comic-Con show come up on IWTV. So make sure you guys check that out. Use code Remarkable when signing up, and you guys can check it out. It's a 4-match mini card that was like fan cam and some good stuff, and headlined by a great match. I'm so glad it wasn't lost to the annals of time. Anthony Gangone and Gabriel Sky originally wasn't going to go up. They weren't able to edit it. The camera footage got kind of discombobulated, but they got it. They put commentary on it. It's all beautiful. I checked it out. So make sure you guys check it out. Support Remarkable Wrestling. And yeah, I appreciate all the support. You can follow at mullet.mania, at Turnbuckle Tavern, at ACEFIELD Retro. We'll keep you up to date on all things wrestling. Colton, anything last you want to get out there?
If you guys are going to get a t-shirt from the Turnbuckle Tavern, make sure you get it from Pro Wrestling Tees or teespring.com. Nowhere else. There's some imitators and fakes out there that are posting our shit up and trying to mark it up and sell it. And make sure you're going to the official sites, Pro Wrestling Tees and teespring.com, because anywhere else is probably going to steal your credit card information and not give you a shirt. You're going to have a bad time.
Yeah, you don't want that happening. Make sure you guys go to theturnbuckletavern.com, and all our links are there. Pro Wrestling Tees, Teespring for all the shirts that we can't post the logos to. Some good stuff there. Support the Tavern, man. If I see a Tavern shirt out in the wild, man, that'll be a day that we feel like we've made it. You know what I mean? Like,
I'd go absolutely crazy if I see a Tavern shirt in the wild, dude.
A Tavern shirt, front row of Dynamite. That's my goal. And not one of us. I want it to be, Tyson, if you listen to this, dude, go front row. I want to see that Tavern shirt. Someone make a Tavern sign with the logo. It's beautiful. It's a beautiful logo. Post it up there and make sure you guys support the Tavern. We're doing all this stuff. And while other podcasts are taking breaks, we're grinding through, man, week after week, giving you guys content because we love what we're doing here. The passion of professional wrestling is evident here, and we love the feedback we get from you. So as always, we'll see you guys next week and continue the ride through Smoky Mountain Wrestling 1994. Until then, we'll catch you guys after a while.